There are bells that are hung to mark the hours, and bells that are hung to mark a life, and the tale I mean to tell you turns upon a bell that was as yet neither. A bell that had no being in the world at all, but a shape drawn in a dead man's book and a hollow up in a stone tower where its voice was one day meant to go. And it begins, as the hard tales so often do, not in the heat and roar of the work itself, but in the cold of a lawyer's upstairs parlor, on a streaming gray afternoon at the tail of a wet late summer. In the cathedral city of Ashcombe, in the year 1831, with the rain coming down the tall sash windows in long, slow ropes, and the sea coal in the little grate hissing and spitting where the wet had got at the chimney, and it was read out into that cold, bright room, while a heavy, well-fed gentleman in a bottle green coat was already up on his feet, and half across the floor, one soft, pale hand laid flat upon the green cloth of the table, as though a man might hold a sentence still by the pressing of his palm. "There is a mistake here, sir," he was saying, "a mistake or a mischief or the wandering of a sick old man's wits. And you will go back and read it me again from the very head of it," while the woman upon whom the whole business turned sat apart from the lot of them by the running window, in a plain gown of russet brown stuff that had been turned once and made over twice at the cuff, and did not so much as turn her head. And I want you, before we go a single step further into that chamber, to look at her the way I have taught myself to look at her across all the years I have carried this story. For she is the whole reason there is a story to carry at all. Her name was Esther Vale, and she was 27 that autumn, a slight, upright young woman, neither tall nor short, with dark hair the color of old bronze drawn back plain off a browned and weather-touched face into a low knot under an undyed linen cap, steady gray eyes set level under dark, straight brows, and a pair of forearms bared to the elbow where the sleeves were turned back out of. Long habit, and on those forearms the marks of her whole life written plain for any who knew how to read them, a fine old silvered burn drawn like a thread across the one, and lower down a little cluster of small pale pits and puckers where the spitting metal had found her over the years and healed white, so that a stranger seeing her hands folded in her lap in that lawyer's room might have taken her for a woman who had come down in the world and would have been exactly wrong, for those were not the hands of a woman who had fallen, but the hands of a woman who had worked, and worked at a thing that fought back. And where any other gentlewoman sitting in Esther Vale's chair that afternoon, with her whole living and her whole name hung upon the next few sentences a stranger chose to read, might have been twisting a handkerchief to a rag or watching the attorney's mouth for the first shape of ruin, Esther Vale was doing none of those things. Esther Vale was listening. She was listening to the rain on the glass, and under the rain to the small tin voice of the water finding the leak in the chimney, and under that again to the fussy little bell of a handcart passing in the wet street below. And she was, without in the least meaning to, and without being able in the least to help it, reading every one of those sounds the way another woman might have read the print on a page, the flat, dead slap of the rain that had no ring in it at all, the mean thin ting of the cheap cart bell that had been cast too quick of bad metal and would never in this life sound sweet, the low true hum that the sash weight gave off, deep in its box behind the shutter, when the drought set it swinging against the pulley, and she was setting each of them, quite against her own will, upon the one long scale she had carried in her head since before she could remember, the scale that ran from the dead thud of a thing with no music in it up through all the middle notes of the ordinary striking world to the one clear ringing truth at the top of it that she had spent her life chasing, and had heard, in all her years, come whole and perfect out of the fire only a very few times. For Esther Vale could not sit in a room and not hear it. She could not hear a poker knocked against a fender, or a spoon set down on a saucer, or a key turned in a lock, without her ear telling her, of its own accord, and before her mind had leave to stop it, whether the thing was true to itself or false, whether it rang round and full, or whether it was cracked or dull or dead. She had a way that had frightened housemaids and amused old men all her life, of picking up any struck thing, a fire iron, a cup, a stray length of pipe, and tapping it once with her knuckle and holding it to her cheek and knowing it, the way a horse doctor knows a wind-broke horse by one cough. And she had been taught to do that. Taught to hear the note in metal and to read the heat in it by its very color, before ever she had been taught her letters or her catechism, so that the Lord's Prayer and the true partials of a well-hung bell had gone into her together in the same warm dark of the same childhood, and neither had ever quite come out of her since. And she had been taught it by the man they had buried 3 days before, and I must give him to you here, for he stands behind every line of what is to come, and you had best carry his face with you the whole way. Amos Vale, master bell founder, gone at 70 in the depth of the winter just past, a great raw-boned old man even at the end of him, with a heavy head of iron-gray hair and a short gray beard stained yellow at the lip from 50 years of leaning over the mold fires, a broad, seamed, fire-reddened face with a white puckered scar across one cheekbone where a blown mold had marked him as a young man, and under the gray shelf of his brows a pair of deep-set gray eyes, the very gray his granddaughter carried now by the window, that had gone soft and kind in a face built for hardness. He had been the last of the Vale founders, of a line of them that had cast bells on the edge of Ashcombe since before anybody living could say, and he had cast in his long day the greater part of the good ringing metal between the Downs and the sea, the sweet-voiced peal at Ashcombe St. Mary's, the ring of 8 at Harnham, the little single bells in 100 village towers that called the plough home of an evening, and his bells were known, wherever men who care for such things gather to talk, by one thing above all the rest, a thing that could not be bought, nor stolen, nor easily copied, which was their tone, for a Vale bell, struck true, did not merely sound, it sang. It gave off a long silver singing note with a kind of dark sweetness folded down inside the brightness of it, a tone that men had tried to name for 100 years and had never bettered than by calling it silken, so that up and down that country a bell of the old man's make was known simply as a silk-voiced bell, and there were rectors who would wait 2 years and pay over the odds to have their tower filled with that one particular sweetness, rather than the harder, flatter, honester ring that any competent founder could give them for less money and in half the time. That was the man, and he had taken his son's orphan daughter into his cold cottage and his hot yard when she was 5 years old and motherless and had nowhere else in the world to be, and instead of sending her to a dame's school to learn to be a lady, he had stood her on an upturned crucible beside the moulding bench and let her put her small hands in the loam, and had taught her, year on year, patient as the seasons, the whole deep mystery of his craft. And he had said of her once, to a man who had raised his brows to see a girl at the strickle-board, that the child had the one thing that could not be taught, and that he had prayed the whole of his life to find in an apprentice, and never had till she came to him, an ear that could not lie to her, and that all the rest of it, the reading and the reckoning and the long slow labor, he could pour into her as into a mold, and it would set true, because the ear at the middle of her was true, so that when Amos Vale died in the January dark with the fever on his chest and the great commission of his life standing half-made and cold in his shut-up yard, there was in all the wide world exactly one pair of hands that had been shaped from childhood to finish it, and they were the hands folded now, in a russet brown lap, by a rain-streaked window in a lawyer's upstairs room. And the whole of the story I am to tell you is only the story of whether those hands would be let. The man reading was a Mr. Silas Fenn, attorney at law of the city of Ashcombe, a spare and upright person of some 63 years, in a suit of plain black superfine gone shiny and green at the elbows, with a pair of steel spectacles pushed up onto his bald brow, and a way of holding the will out at arm's length, and reading it in a dry, level, unhurried voice that gave no more weight to the line that lifted a soul up than to the line that cast one down, which is, if you have never had the misfortune to sit under it, the one truly pitiless way a will can be read to a person who is praying with all their heart that the words will somehow bend. He did not stop for the heavy gentleman on his feet at the table's end. He only waited a single beat, and drew the spectacles down off his brow onto the bridge of his nose, and looked over the tops of them, and said mildly, "Miss Pruitt, sir, you shall be heard. Upon my honor you shall. But the dead man has the first word of it by right and by law, and I'll thank you to let me give it him." And then he went back to the paper. "I give and devise, read Mr. Fenn, all that my foundry, works, and yard, known as the Vale Bell Foundry, together with the dwelling cottage, the garden and the drying sheds and the close of ground about it, and all my furnaces, molding pits, cranes, tackle, patterns, strickle boards and gauges, my stock of copper and of block, tin, and of coke, and the whole art, mystery, and goodwill of the trade thereof, standing upon the low ground under the cathedral wall in the city of Ashcombe. And further I give the bound oak chest that stands in the press of the cottage, being my book of bell scales and my book of receipts for the metal, writ in my own hand and in my own private manner of writing, which is worth more than all the rest of it laid together to the one pair of hands in this world that can read it, and which I straitly charge my heir to keep close, and to keep secret, and to read." And there the old attorney checked, half a breath, not for any love of drama, for Silas Fenn was no more a man for drama than a boundary stone is, but because he knew the next of it was the sting, and he was too honest a hand at his trade to soften a sting the dead had meant to be felt. All of which, he read on, "I give unto my granddaughter Esther Vale, spinster, absolutely and to her own proper use, upon this one condition. And the condition is the marrow, and the whole of it, that the great tenor bell which I stand commissioned by the dean and chapter to cast for the tower of the cathedral church against its rehallowing, and which lies in my yard at my death unfinished and never poured, shall be cast whole, and tuned true to its note, and hung and swung upon its stock in the cathedral tower, and this done in the bell standing dumb and ready in the frame before the day the church is rededicated at the feast of St. Michael next coming. And if my said granddaughter shall do this thing, then is the whole of my estate hers, without let or cavil or question of any man. But if at that day the bell be not cast, nor tuned, nor hung, then shall the foundry, and the cottage, and the works, and the goodwill, and every last pattern and gauge and ingot and clinker of it pass over entire and absolute unto my cousin's son, Josiah Pruitt, bell and brass founder, of the town of Marchbourne, to have and to hold as his own forever." There the reading stopped, and into the stopping came only the hiss of the wet coal and the long run of the rain. And the heavy gentleman by the table let out a slow breath through his nose, that was very like the breath of a man setting down at last a weighty box he has carried a great way, and is heartily glad to be quit of. And you had best have him whole this once, so that we need never stop the tale again to draw him, Josiah Pruitt, of Marchbourne, a man of some 45 years, portly and soft and high in the color, with sandy hair thinning and combed with great care across a pink scalp, and a pair of small, pale, busy blue eyes that did their quiet reckoning behind the rest of a face that was always, at the front of it, smiling. Dressed that day richly for a wet country afternoon in a bottle green tailcoat and a straining figured waistcoat, with a heavy gold chain looped across the swell of it, and a bunch of fob seals that his soft fingers turned and turned as he spoke. And he was, let it be said plainly and once, a bell founder in the way that a great many prosperous men are the thing they call themselves, that is, he owned it rather than did it. He owned 2 good furnaces and a brass shop and better than 30 men over at Marchbourne, and he took the orders and he set the prices and he signed his name in a fine round hand to the bills, and his bells were sound enough, honest commercial metal that rang well enough to satisfy a parish that did not know better. But Josiah Pruitt in all his 45 years had never once stood the long night through at the tapping of a great melt with the sweat running off him and the fear of God on him, had never swept a core with his own 2 hands, nor read the color off the metal with his own eye, nor known in his own stomach that particular sickness of the hour before a pour, when a man does not yet know whether the thing he has spent half a year making will come up out of the pit whole, or come up ruined. His soft pink hands had never truly been blacked by the trade he lived so comfortably upon, and there was in him, under all the smiling, that especial hardness that you will find only in the man who profits by a mystery he has never himself been humbled by. He turned his seals now, and he let the smile come up warm across the front of his face. And he did not so much argue against the will as gather it up gently in both hands, the way a kind man gathers up a thing that is already broken and past mending. "Well," he said, and his voice was soft and warm and brimful of a terrible reasonableness. "Well, there it is, and a sorry thing it is. And I'll not stand up before this good company and pretend to you it is anything in the world but the last sad fancy of a great man whose mind had gone before his heart did. For you, all of you, knew my Uncle Amos, and you know what a founder he was, and what a stubborn old lion he was to the end, and you know besides how the 2 of them doted. The old man and this poor girl, thick as thieves in that yard from the time she was a mite, and it is small wonder to me, none in the world, that at the very last of it, with the fever burning in him and the fires all gone cold out there under the wall, he should lie abed and dream himself a comfortable dream of her carrying it on after him. But a dream is one thing, gentlemen," he said, and turning the seals, "and a bell is another. And I say what I am going to say with no unkindness whatsoever toward my cousin here." And he inclined the sandy head the smallest half-inch toward the window, without ever once bringing his eyes as far as her face. But it wants saying, for her own sake most of all, before this goes any further and the poor creature is let to break her heart against it, there is not, and there never has been, in the memory of any guild or company or foundry in this whole kingdom, a woman who has cast a true bell. "It is not a cruelty in me to say it," he said gently. "It is only a fact, as plain and as settled a fact as that the moon does not give heat. The casting of great bells is the work of strong guild-sworn men who have broken their backs at it since they were boys. Men who can heave the cope and stand the fire and swing the crane, and it is beyond the strength of any woman living, let her love it how she may. And past even the strength of it, there is the deep art of the metal and the deeper art of the tuning, the getting of a great bell true to its own note so that it will sing in the tower and not sour. And that art, gentlemen," and here for the first time the smile thinned, and the small blue eyes came up cold and steady over the room, "that art has never in the history of the world been held by a woman's hand, and it will not, I think we may be very sure, begin to be held by one now. in a dead man's cold and empty yard, by a penniless girl of 27, with no journeyman to help her, and no metal to melt, and not 5 pounds in the world to buy so much as the coke to light the furnace. He spread the soft pink hands, and he let the smile come back, warmer than ever. "Say the word is done," he said. "Say the condition cannot be met, as in mercy and in plain sense it cannot. And let the poor child be spared the whole long agony of trying and failing in the eye of the whole county. And let the works come quietly and decently to me, who at the least will keep the good old name alive and cast honest bells under it. And I will see her comfortable. Upon my word I will. I'll settle a little annuity on her out of my own pocket, and she shall never want. For I'd not have it said that Josiah Pruitt turned his own blood out of doors. Whatever the law let him do." It was, you will grant, very handsomely done. There was not a hard word in the whole of it. Not one. He had buried her under kindness the way a man may smother a fire under a wet blanket, gently, and to spare the room the smoke, and every gentleman present who had come there that afternoon half sorry, for the girl went out of it, I have no doubt, thinking Josiah Pruitt a Christian fellow and the will a pity and the thing as good as settled. And through the whole of it Esther Vale sat by her window and did not once move, and did not once open her mouth to defend herself, and let him say it all. And if you had been in the room, and had looked at her as I would have you learn to look at her, you would have seen only a still young woman in a made-over gown, with her scarred hands folded and her gray eyes turned to the gray water on the glass, and you would have thought very likely that she had not the spirit even to answer him. But she was not looking at the glass. She was listening to him, the whole soft length of it, the way she listened to everything, tapping the man once in her mind and holding him to her ear, and under the warm, reasonable voice she could hear, plain as she heard the cracked cart bell in the street, the one flat dead note at the middle of him, the note of a thing cast quick and cheap and untrue, a thing that had never once rung whole. And it was that, and not his kindness, and not his logic, and not the plain, impossible arithmetic of it, that decided her, sitting there, before ever she had said a word, or seen the cold furnace, or so much as lifted the lid of her grandfather's chest. For it is a hard thing to be pitied by a man your own ear tells you is false, and Esther Vale had been made, from the cradle up, unable to mistake a false note for a true one, in metal or in men. So that when Mr. Silas Fenn, who was an honest man and disliked the whole warm smell of the business more than he would say, folded the will along its old creases and looked over his steel spectacles at the still figure by the window, and asked her, dry and courteous, whether she had understood the terms as read, and whether she wished to say anything to the company, she rose, unhurried, and smoothed the russet stuff of her gown, and she said only, in a low, even voice that had in it not a scrap of heat and not a scrap of pleading, that she had understood every word of it, and that she would want the key to the yard. And the room, which had settled itself so comfortably around the notion that the thing was over, went very quiet at that, and Josiah Pruitt's turning fingers stopped upon his seals for the space of one breath, before the smile came back, and he told them all warmly, going out into the wet with his coat collar up, that it was a sad, sad business, and that the girl would come to her senses inside the month. Once she had stood one time in that dead cold yard and understood what a furnace gone out really means. And he was so very certain of it, so easy and so sure, that not a man there thought to doubt him, that the cold furnace under the cathedral wall would do his work for him, and beat her, and hand him the whole of it without his ever needing to lift so much as one of his soft pink hands. She did not go home first, for there was no home now that was only hers to go home to. There was only the thing the dead man had laid upon her, and the cold place where the thing must be done. And so when the chamber broke up, and the men went off in their several directions with their several certainties, her cousin the loudest and the surest of them, Esther Vale went the one way none of them thought worth the walking, which was out through the shutting city and down to the water meadows on its northern edge where the Vale foundry stood, to look with her own eyes at what she had been given and what it would take to keep it. It was a raw, bright afternoon at the tail of the winter. The sky scoured a hard, clean blue between the clouds and the wind coming off the river with a knife in it, and she went on foot because a foundry is a thing you should come to on foot the first time, slowly, the way you would come up on a horse you meant to buy, reading it whole across the last field before you read it in its parts. And she came out through the last of the lanes past the tan yards and the timber wharf, with the great gray bulk of the cathedral standing up behind her over the roofs of the close, its tower square and blunt against the moving sky, and the scaffolding still lashed about the parapet where the masons had been at the Ree facing all that winter. And she did not look back at it, though every step she took was in a manner of speaking a step toward it, for it was that tower and the great mouth of it waiting empty that had been made her whole life's business in a cold room not 2 hours since. She came to the foundry gate, and she stopped at it, and she looked. And I would have you stop and look with her. It was a long, straggling huddle of buildings of soft red brick and weathered black weatherboarding, thrown up and added to over 60 years without a plan in the world beyond the plan of the work itself. Roofed in old clay pantiles gone the green-gray of a drake's back and sway-backed over the ridge where the rain had had its way with a rafter, and at the heart of it, rising through the low roofs, stood the great square stack of the melting furnace, dead and cold and streaked down its brick with a year of weather, with no shimmer of heat above its mouth and no thread of smoke. And that above all else was the loud thing in the quiet yard to a woman raised where she was raised. For a working foundry is like a working forge in this, that it is never truly cold and never truly still. There is always the tick of metal somewhere giving up its heat, the sigh of a banked fire, the drip and settle of a wet mold drying, and this yard was as still as the inside of a bell that has never once been rung. And the stillness of it was the stillness of a whole year. And she stood in the gate and let it come into her. The gate itself hung open and dropped on its hinge, and the puddled ruts of the yard had frozen and thawed and frozen again into a churned iron hard clay that no cart had marked since the autumn, and she stepped over the threshold onto her own ground and went in among the dead works, reading them one by one. There was the melting furnace under its stack, the reverberatory, a long, low brick vault of a thing built waist-high like a great blind oven, with its fire bridge at the one end where the coke was fed and its tapping hole at the other, stopped now with a plug of dried clay gone pale and cracked, and its low roof inside was meant to throw the flame down flat across the surface of the metal without the fuel ever touching it, so that a whole ton of copper and tin might be brought up to the run in one long roaring heat, and the firebed of it was a cold gray drift of last year's clinker, undisturbed, with the shape of the last banked fire still pressed into the ash the way a head leaves its shape in a pillow, and she looked a long moment at that pressed gray shape, for she knew whose hand had raked it out and left it, and she knew it had been meant to be raked over and woken in a week, and it had waited a year. Beyond the furnace the ground opened into the casting house, the great dim shed with the doors gone off it at one end, and in the floor of the casting house was the pit. The pit was the thing, The pit was the whole heart of the place and the mark of what it had been built to do. For a foundry that casts nothing bigger than handbells and firebacks needs no pit at all. It does its work standing up on the floor. But a foundry that undertakes the great bells, the tenors, the ton and more voices that hang alone at the bottom of a ring and speak for a whole city, that foundry must dig, because the mold for such a bell cannot stand up in the open and take the push of the metal. It must be sunk and buried and rammed round with earth to hold it against the terrible sideways weight of a lake of molten bronze. And so there in the floor of the casting house was the pit her grandfather had dug and steined with brick 40 years before, a good 10 foot deep and near as wide, with the timber crane standing over it, the gantry and the jib and the great slow gear of the crab that lifted the cope mold in and out, and the chains hanging down into the dark of the pit, dead still. And down in the pit, half made, was the mold. She went to the edge of it and knelt on the frozen boards and looked down. And there it stood at the bottom in the cold shadow, the beginning of the great work, the core, a broad squat beehive of brick laid up dome-wise over an iron spindle, rough and red, waiting for its skin of loam. No more than the first coarse foundation of the shape that was to be, and round the lip of the pit lay all the tackle of the thing gone, a year cold and green. The loam benches with their troughs where the molding clay was tempered and trodden, the barrows, the ramming tools, and leant against the brick pier where he had set it down the last evening of his life, the strickleboard. She looked longest at that. It was a great sweep of oak plank, taller than she was, cut down one long edge into a curved and hollowed profile, like the shadow of half a bell laid on its side, worn silk smooth along the working edge with the loam of 100 moldings, and it hung on its iron gudgeon from the central spindle so that a man might swing it round and round upon the soft loam and let that one-shaped edge shave, and sweep the wet clay to the exact curve cut into the board. And there is the first of the two secrets of this whole tale, though she did not lift it yet, for that curve cut down the edge of the strickleboard was the bell's very shape, its scale, the one line from lip to shoulder to crown that makes a bell and not a bucket, and no two founders' boards are cut alike, and a bell swept true to a good board will ring true to itself all its life, and a bell swept to a bad one will hang in a tower and sour the ears of a parish for 300 years, and no power on earth will mend it. She knelt and looked at the great worn board a long while, and did not touch it, and the wind came in the open end of the casting house and moved nothing, because there was nothing left in the place light enough to move. And it was while she knelt there at the lip of the pit that she found she was not alone in the yard, for there had come, so soft she had not marked it under the wind, the small dry scratch of a birch besom on frozen brick. And she rose and went out to the sound, and there at the far corner of the yard by the coke heaps was an old man sweeping. He was a very old man, small and bent and dry as a lath, in a smock frock gone the no color of long weather and a shapeless felt hat. And he was sweeping the clean-swept cobbles of a corner that no foot had dirtied in a month, sweeping them slow and careful and to no purpose in the world but the doing of it. And she knew him before he turned, for she had been a child about his knees. It was Simon Croft, who had stood at the mouth of that furnace and fed it and read its heats for her grandfather for 50 years, and who was now so deaf that the great bells themselves came to him only as a trembling in the chest, and who had gone on, she saw, coming down to the dead yard morning by morning through the whole of that silent year, letting himself in at the dropped gate and sweeping the paths and squaring the tools and keeping the place as though the master were only gone up to the city and might be back by dinner, because it was the one thing his hands still knew how to do for grief. She came round in front of him where he could see her, and the old face came up, and it worked a moment. And then he knew her, and he did not say much, for he was past easy speech and knew it. He only looked from her face to the dead furnace and back, and put a hard old hand out and just touched her sleeve at the burn scar on her forearm, as a man might touch a thing to be sure it is real, and said, in the flat, over-loud voice of the very deaf, "You've come, then." And she nodded so he could see it, and he nodded back, and that was the whole of the compact between them, and it held to the end. She had him bring her up to the cottage then, the little brick house at the top of the yard where the old man had lived and died, and she lit no fire yet, but went straight through the cold rooms to the winding press in the far chamber, the great built cupboard by the chimney breast, and opened it, and there in the bottom of it, under a fold of sacking, was the chest. It was a plain black oak coffer the length of her arm, iron-bound, the lock long since sprung and mended with a hasp, and she carried it to the deal table under the window where the last of the afternoon came in gray gold, and she opened it. And this is the second secret and the true one. This is the thing the whole of it turns upon, so mark it. Inside were his books. There was the pattern book, the great limp vellum ledger of the bell scales, page upon page of the shapes of bells drawn out full and half and quarter in his own hand, each one gridded and figured and named, this scale for a treble and this for a tenor, this the old scale and this the new, the whole hoarded geometry of 60 years of listening. And there was the book of receipts, the smaller book, the book of the metal, in which was set down the one thing that made a Vale bell and not another man's, the exact marriage of the copper and the tin. So much fine copper to so much block tin to bring the bronze to that particular hard, bright, singing temper. A little richer in the tin than most men dared to go, because tin past a point turns brittle and will crack in the frost or under the clapper, and a little short of it is dull and leaden and dead, and somewhere on that knife's edge between the two lay the thing the Vale bells were famous 3 counties round for, the silver in the voice, the long silken singing hum that hung in the air over a churchyard for half a minute after the note was struck and would not die. And here was the whole cruelty and the whole beauty of what her grandfather had done, for the books were written, every page of them, in cipher, not in any clerk's cipher of numbers and keys, but in his own crabbed shorthand of the trade, his own private marks for the metals and the measures and the tempers, half of it in a Sussex dialect of the foundry that had died with the men who spoke it, and half of it in signs he had made up for himself as a young man and never taught to a living soul but one, and that one was the child who had sat on the loam bench at his elbow and been taught to read the marks before she was taught to read her letters, because he had known, being a founder, and therefore a man who thought in 300 years, that a secret written plain is a secret sold, and a secret written in a hand that only love can read will keep until love comes for it. She sat at the cold table and turned the stiff pages, and her eye ran down the ciphered lines, and they opened to her one by one like a door giving to a key cut for it alone, and I will tell you plainly that she wept a little then, once, without any change in her face, and then she stopped and read on, because there was no time in the world now for the other thing. And as she read, the craft of it came up around her the way he had first laid it out, and it is worth the laying out here so that you will understand what a mountain the one commission truly was. To cast a great bell is to make, in loam and brick and buried fire, 3 bells where only one will ever ring. First you sweep the core, the inner mold, the beehive of brick you have already seen, and you daub it with the fine loam, and you swing the strickle board round upon it, and shave the loam to the true inner curve of the bell, and dry it hard with slow fires banked inside it, And that is the first false bell, the shape of the hollow. Then over the dried core you build the second, the thickness, the crook or false bell. Another skin of loam swept to the bell's outer line so that between the core and it lies the exact gap, thick at the sound bow where the clapper strikes and thin up the waist, that the metal will one day fill. And on this false bell, while the loam is leather hard, you lay the inscription and the founder's marks and the moldings in wax, the year and the dedication and the name, reversed and raised, to be printed into the metal. And then over all of that you build the third, the cope, the great outer casing of loam and iron banding, built up and dried and bound. And when it is hard you lift it whole away on the crane, and you break away and strip out the false bell in the middle, the whole shape of it, and you cast it aside in pieces, for its only work in this world was to hold the place. And you lower the cope back down over the bare core, and where the false bell was is now empty, a bell-shaped hollow of air waiting in the dark of the pit, and you ram the earth hard around the whole of it, and you dry it against the one killing enemy of the founder, which is any hidden breath of damp. For a mold run with metal, while a pocket of wet still lies in it, will turn that wet to steam in a heartbeat and blow the whole casting back up out of the pit in a sheet of fire, and only then, when the buried mold is bone dry and rammed and true, do you bring the furnace to the run and pour. That is the making of the body. But the body is not the bell. The bell is the voice. And the voice is the hard part and the true part and the part no man's strength can force. For a bell is not one note, but a chord of them sounding together. The deep hum note under all, and the strike note the ear calls the pitch, and above and within them the tierce and the quint and the nominal, the partials, the several voices, the one casting must hold all at once and hold in tune with one another, and if the scale is false or the metal is wrong, they will quarrel. The tierce will sour against the prime, and the thing will clang instead of sing, and there is no mending it in the mold. There is only the tuning after, the slow shaving of metal from the inside of the cooled bell, a little here to sink the note, and a little there to true the fifth, paring away at a thing you cannot add back to, and past a certain shaving the bell is only ruined thinner, and you begin again from the loam. All of that, the whole 3 months mountain of it, core and cope and false bell and drying and pour and cooling and tuning, all of it once, and it must come right the once. For a great bell is a whole year's metal and a whole year's labor in a single run. And there is no second casting to a woman who has one furnace, one commission, and a feast day set for the ruin of her. And the bell she had been left to raise was no ordinary tenor either, but the great voice of the cathedral itself, the largest to hang in that tower in 200 years. Its metal alone, a weight to make strong men look at one another. And it was to hang and to ring true on the morning of the rededication or the whole of it. The yard and the cottage and the books and her grandfather's 50 years passed to the soft-handed cousin who had never in his life swept a strickleboard with his own arm. She closed the chest at last in the last of the light and sat with her hand flat upon its cold lid, and old Croft stood in the doorway and watched her and said nothing. And she made up her mind there, without a word, in the way she made up all the hardest things. But the mold and the metal were hers to attempt only if the men who owned the tower would let her attempt them, and so the next morning early she put on her plain dark gown and went up through the close to the chapter house to ask the dean, and chapter for the leave that her grandfather's contract had never dreamed would need asking. And I will not pretend to you that it went kindly, for it did not. They received her in the cold paneled room under the windows, the dean a dry and courteous and comfortable old man, who plainly wished the whole matter at the bottom of the river, and the canons ranged along the table with their faces variously set in pity and in doubt, and in a thin ecclesiastical amusement that was worse than either. And they had already, she saw at once, all but promised the finishing of the bell to her cousin, whose foundry was known, and whose name was known, and who had waited upon them very smoothly the week before. And they put it to her gently and immovably that this was the great bell of the mother church of the diocese, and no place for an experiment, that the contract had been with Amos Vale, the master, and not with his household, that no woman within the memory or the records of the Founders' Guild had ever cast and hung a ring bell of any weight, let alone a tenor of this, and that they must think first of the tower and the ringers and the honor of the church. And Esther Vale stood before them with her scarred forearms and her level gray eyes, and did not plead, for she had learned from the cold master in the churchyard that a founder does not argue a bell, a founder casts one and lets it argue for itself. She only said, when the dean had finished, that the commission was her grandfather's, and the metal was bought, and the mold was begun, that she asked no penny in advance, and no promise of favor, that she asked only leave to bring the bell to the rededication at her own charge and her own risk, and that if on that morning it did not hang true and ring true in the tower, they might strike her name from it, and give the whole to whom they pleased, and she would go without a word. It was so plain an offer, and cost them so exactly nothing, that they could not for shame refuse it. And the dean looked down the table, and the canons looked at their hands, and in the end they granted her leave in the very act of telling one another with their eyes that they were granting a poor grieving woman rope enough to be quietly disappointed with. And they let her out again into the close, believing to a man that the cold furnace would beat her before the spring was old, and spare them all the awkwardness. She came out under the scaffolded tower and stood a moment and looked up the whole gray height of it to the black louvered window of the belfry where the great bell must one day hang, and she measured it with her eye the way she measured everything, and then she went home to her fires. There was one man in that city, though, who did not look at her with pity, and it is right that this chapter should end on him, for he stands at her shoulder through all the rest of it. His name was Marsh, Captain Josiah Marsh, a widower and a grave, quiet, square-built man of some 45 years, who had cast guns for the ordnance through the long war, and had come home when the war ended with a limp and a small competence and a settled distaste for casting anything that killed, and had turned his knowledge of great metal to the hanging of bells instead, the making of the oaken frames and the wheels and the iron gudgeons and stays that let a ton of bronze swing safe in a tower. And he had known Amos Vale and worked bell and frame with him 20 years, and he came down to the foundry the second evening, unasked, walking his slow soldier's walk in over the frozen ruts, and he did not take his hat off and make her a speech of condolence, and he did not tell her it was no work for a woman. He stood in the door of the casting house and looked down into the pit at the half-made core a while with his hands behind his back, the way a man looks at a thing he understands. And then he told her, in few plain words, that he had heard in the town what the chapter had granted, and what they thought of their granting it, and that he was of a different mind. For he had seen her grandfather's bells, and he had seen her at that furnace when she was a girl no higher than the bench, and he had marked even then that she had the ear, which is the one thing in the whole trade that cannot be taught and cannot be bought and cannot be hired for a wage. And then he told her that he had a first load of good clean copper standing in his own yard, bought for a job that had fallen through, and that she should have it now and settle for it when the bell was hung and paid, and no interest and no papers, on his word and her word, because a bell wanted starting, and metal was dear, and he did not choose to see the Vale furnace stand cold for the want of it. She looked at him a long moment across the cold shed, this grave man offering her the one thing that was neither charity nor pity, but only the plain trust of one maker for another. And she took it, and shook his hard hand on it, and that was the whole of the bargain. And it was the first warm thing that had happened to her since the will was read. And when he had gone, she stood in the dark casting house with the first of it settled, and the mountain still whole in front of her, the cold furnace and the empty pit, and the ciphered books and the tower waiting. And she was not afraid, or if she was, she had long ago learned to bank the fear the way her grandfather banked a fire, low and covered, and kept for its use. And she went up to the cottage and lit the lamp at last and opened the book of the metal, and began, "Now a man who means to beat you and has the strength to do it in the open will come at you in the open. And there is a rough mercy in that, for a blow you can see is a blow you can set your feet against." But her cousin was not that kind of man, and had never in his soft, prosperous life struck a stroke that a witness could afterwards have sworn to. And the war he opened against Esther Vale that spring he opened the way he did everything, quietly at a distance, without once raising his voice or blackening his own pink hand, so that a stranger riding through the close in those weeks would have seen only a woman's small foundry failing of its own weakness at the edge of the city, and would never once have seen the patient hand that was closing, finger by finger, upon its throat. She had come out of the chapter house with her leave granted, grudging and cold as it was, and she had Captain Marsh's first load of copper stacked honest in the shed, and old Simon Croft keeping the furnace mouth. And for the space of a day or two she had let herself believe that the worst of it was the doubt of strangers, which a body could outwork. She was wrong about that, and she found it out within the week, and she found it out first at the place where a founder is softest, which is not the metal and not the money, but the 2 or 3 other pairs of trained hands, without which one pair, however gifted, cannot build a great mold in a deep pit, and cannot charge and skim and pour a furnace, and cannot do in the weeks left to her a thing that ought by rights to take a full year. For a bell is not a horseshoe, and this is the thing the city never understood about what was being asked of her, and it is the thing you must understand before you can rightly weigh what the cousin did. A smith may stand at his anvil alone and turn out good work all the day long, with none but a boy to blow for him. But the casting of a great tenor bell is the labor of a crew, for the mold of it is built up wet and heavy in a pit sunk below the floor, the core swept true with the strickleboard and dried with slow fires, the false bell laid over that, and the cope built over the false bell. Every stage of it 100 weights of loam that must be lifted and turned and struck off smooth, while another pair of hands steadies the sweep and a third tends the drying. And then the metal, a mountain of copper and block tin melted all in one charge and run down in one unbroken stream. For a bell poured in 2 pours is a bell cracked before ever it is cool, and a stream of white bronze does not wait upon a woman working single-handed. She had known this from a child. She had known it from watching her grandfather, who for all his mastery had never cast the great work with fewer than 4 good men about him, and she had reckoned, sitting up over her figures in the cottage those first nights, that she must have at the least 2 journeyman moulders who knew loam work, men she could set to the sweep and the cope and trust to strike a joint true. And there were 2 such within a day's ride, honest craftsmen both, a little out of regular work that season, and she had spoken to them before ever the will was cold, and had their half word that they would come to her when she sent. She sent in the 2nd week, And the elder of the two sent back word by a carter's boy that he was bespoke now on a long job, and could not be got. And the younger sent no word at all, which was worse. And when she rode over the hill to have it plain from his own mouth, being a woman who would rather hear a hard thing said to her face than carried to her soft in a message, she found him mending a wall behind his cottage, and he would not straighten up off the wall to look at her, but kept his eyes upon the stones and his hands busy among them, and said only that a man had to think of the winters ahead, and of whose yards he might be wanting a place in when this one season's work was done, and that he was very sorry, and that he wished her well, and that he could not come. And she did not press him, for there is no profit and less than no kindness in shaming a frightened man. And she knew, sitting her horse in his lane in the thin spring rain, exactly whose money and whose soft managing word had reached him before she did. For a bell founder with 3 fires and 40 men and a long purse in the neighboring town has a great deal of work to give a journeyman across a lifetime, and a woman with a cold pit and 11 weeks has none to give past Whitsun, and a frightened man does his own sum and needs no help with the arithmetic of it. So she rode home with the 2 pairs of hands she had counted on struck clean off her tally, and she said nothing of it to the girls, and she banked it down inside her the way she had been taught to bank a fire she meant to keep alive through a long cold night, and she went on. The metal was the next finger to close, and it closed cunningly, for the cousin was too clever to be seen refusing her copper, which would have named him. What happened instead was only that the city ran dry. The 2 factors who kept metal in any quantity within reach of the close found, when her order came, that they were very short of copper this season, sadly short, and shorter still of block tin, which is the dearer and the scarcer of the 2, and the very thing that gives a veil bell its silver. For the tin is the soul of the tone, and a bell run poor in tin comes out of the pit dull and leaden and dead however true its shape. And what little they had they could let her have only at a price half as high again as her grandfather had ever paid, and no promise of more. She understood it the moment the first figure was named to her, understood that a man with ready money and a standing account can go quietly round a city buying up the copper and the tin against a rival's need, not to use it, only to have it out of her way, and to make her metal come to her dear and short and late, and that there is nothing in the law nor in the guild's book against a man buying metal, and no way under heaven to prove that he bought it to starve her. Captain Marsh's first load had started her, but a great tenor bell is a charge of many hundredweights, near a ton of good bronze run in a single stream, and the captain's charity, which he did not call charity, could not be leaned upon for the whole of it without unmanning them both, and she would not so lean upon it, and the cousin had reckoned on precisely that pride, and had priced it into his sum. And after the men and the metal he went at the very fuel and the very earth. The colliers who brought the coke to fire a reverberatory furnace, that fierce clean coke that a melting furnace must have and that no woodpile can stand in for, found reasons of a sudden to be carrying elsewhere, their loads all bespoke, their carts all promised, and the diggers who cut and carried the special loam, the tough molding clay bound with sand and horse dung and hair that a bell mold is built of, and that comes only from 2 or 3 known banks in that country, were warned, gently, by nobody they could name, that the Vale Works would not last the spring, and that a wise man did not bind himself to a shop that would be shut, and its owner sold up by Whitsun with his bill unpaid, and so the coke came thin and the loam came thinner, and every honest thing a foundry drinks and eats to stay alive was made. Not forbidden her, only made difficult, made dear, made slow, made to arrive a day late and a load short, by that one soft, patient hand that never showed itself and never had to. But the cruelest stroke of all cost him nothing, for it was only a word, and he set it loose to do its patient work in the dark, the way you loose a ferret down a hole and walk away. The word he set loose was this, that a woman's bell would crack in the tower and kill a ringer. It was a clever word, because it was not wholly a lie, for bells do crack. Good bells cast by sworn masters crack at the sound bow after honest years of ringing. And a bell that is cast false, run poor or cooled wrong or shaped untrue, may crack early, and may, cracking or breaking loose of a mold-flawed crown, come down through the ringing chamber upon the men below. And there is no ringer living who has not heard the tale of some bell that flew, and no ringer who does not carry, under his Sunday coat, a plain animal fear of the great swinging masses of metal over his head. So when it was whispered along the ale benches and over the churchyard wall, and at last, softly, in the very chapter house itself, that the tenor the veil woman meant to hang was a woman's work, and might well be the death of whichever poor fellow stood under it on its first full swing, the word went in deep, and it went in to stay, and it turned the chapter's cold doubt into something colder, and it turned the ringers, who had been merely amused at her, wary and then hostile, for a man will forgive you a great deal sooner than he will forgive you the fear you have put into him for his own neck. She heard the word going round. She could not answer it, for you cannot answer a fear with a promise. You can answer it only with a true bell hung and rung. And the true bell was weeks away, and buried yet in a heap of loam and a locked black book, and so she had to stand and let the word do its work and say nothing, which of all the hard things of that spring was very near the hardest. And it was under the whole weight of that, the men gone, the metal dear, the fuel short, the word working against her in the one place she needed most to be trusted, that she made the single true mistake of the whole affair, and I will not hide it from you nor soften it, for she would not have thanked me to, and because the mistake is the very hinge the story turns on. The chapter, uneasy now, the rumor working in them, sent down to her by their clerk of the works a stiff, cold message that was very near an ultimatum, that before they carried the matter further, before more of the parish's good money was suffered to go into a doubtful thing, they should be glad of some token, some proof that the shop could raise a true bell note at all. Let her cast them but a small bell, a proving bell, and let it be struck before witnesses, and if it rang true, they would hold to their bargain the readier, and if it did not, why? Then they would all of them know where they stood. It was a reasonable sounding thing, and it was a trap, though I do not think the honest churchwardens who carried it knew it for one. For the man who had put the notion into the chapter's head knew very well that she was not ready, knew that the copper she had was short of tin, and the loam half dried, and the crew not yet made, and the cipher not yet fully read, and knew that a proving bell cast in haste, to a borrowed pattern out of poor metal, by a woman driven to it before her time, would ring dead. And she knew it too, knew it in her bones the moment the message was read to her, knew she should say no, take her week, take her month, and cast nothing until the thing was right. But she was 27, and she was proud, and she was tired past the good sense that tiredness is the first thing to go, and the fear word was eating her name alive in the city while she waited, and she thought, against everything her grandfather had ever taught her about the fatal folly of hurrying a fire, that a small true note struck now before the doubters might buy her the peace to do the great work right. So she said she would cast their proving bell, and she should not have. She built the little mold in 2 hard days where it should have had 5, and the loam of it did not dry as loam must dry, slow and clear through, but only skinned over warm on the outside with the wet still held in its heart, and she knew it, and drove on. And she charged the small furnace with the poor short metal she had. Copper enough, but the tin scanted, because the tin was the thing the city had cornered, and she could not get it, and would not run to the captain for it. And she brought it to color, and skimmed it, and ran it. And the mold, being damp at its heart, hissed and spat at the metal, and gave her a bad half-minute at the pit's edge before it took the pour, without blowing, which was the one mercy of that whole black day. And then there was the long wait for the cooling, which cannot be hurried either. And at the end of it she broke the cope away with her own hands in the gray dawn light, with the girls and old Croft and the captain standing by. And there in the pit lay a little bell, whole to the eye, sound to the eye, gray and new. And she lifted it out, and she hung it on the trial frame the captain had knocked together, and she took up the little hammer, and every soul in that yard went still, and she struck it, and it rang dead. There is no other word does the thing justice, and no way to make it sound to you as it sounded to her. But I will try, because you must feel it, if you are to feel the rest. A true bell struck sends up one clean living note that stands in the air and blooms and hangs and sings itself out slow through all its partials in accord. The hum and the strike note, and the third and the fifth, and the octave all leaning true upon one another, so that the ear is filled and satisfied as by a chord sung by one throat. And this little bell gave up instead a short flat clacking clank, a dull leaden knock with no bloom in it, and no length, and no silver, a sound like a cracked crock struck with a spoon, dead before it was fairly born. And under it, worst of all, a faint sick buzz that told a founder's ear there was a flaw run somewhere in the sound bow, that a harder blow would open to a crack. It fell into the silent yard like a dropped plate. Nobody said anything. The girls did not understand the whole of it, but they understood the faces, and the captain's grave, scarred face did not change at all, which was its own kind of kindness. And old Croft looked at the ground, and Esther Vale stood with the little hammer still in her hand, and the dead thing hanging in front of her, and heard, in that flat clank, everything the city had said of her spoken back to her in a voice she could not argue with, which was the voice of the metal itself. She had asked the iron a question in front of witnesses, and the iron had answered no, and the answer travailed, as she had known it must the instant she heard it, for the clerk of the works had sent a man to hear the proof, and a ringer had come with him out of curiosity. And by that evening it was over the city that the Vale woman had cast her bell at last, and it had rung like a cracked pot. And by the next day the tale had grown in the telling, until some had it, that the bell had burst in the pit, and some that it had cracked across on the first blow, and it did not much matter which, for the meaning of it was the same in every mouth, that she was beaten, that it was proven now and not merely feared, that the old man's folly had run its course, and the girl had had her lesson, and there was nothing left but the melancholy of watching her spend her last shilling before she gave it up. The pity, which had been a soft and shifting thing, a thing that might yet have turned to belief if she had given it cause, went hard that week all through the county into a settled certainty. And settled certainty is a colder companion than open scorn, for scorn will at least look at you, and certainty has already turned away. Even the two frightened churchwardens who had wished her no ill came no more down the lane. She was, that gray week, as thoroughly and as publicly beaten a soul as any in that country, and every reasonable person in it knew exactly how the thing would end, and every reasonable person in it was wrong, and the reason they were wrong is the whole of what remains for me to tell you. For it was down in that same low week, with the dead proving bell stood in the corner of the shop where she would not let it be melted, keeping it there on purpose the way another woman might keep a scar. That the thing which was truly going to win this began quietly to gather itself in the yard, and it did not look like winning, and it did not look like much of anything. It looked only like the leavings of the world coming together in a cold shop, because they had nowhere else that would have them. There were the two girls first. Peg came up the heath the morning after the failed proof, a broad, sturdy, red-armed girl of some 17 years with a plain, blunt, honest face and a back like a young ox, who had been turned from every farm and every kitchen and every workshop door in the parish, not for any fault of hand or heart, but for being too big and too rough and too plain-spoken for the notions those doors held of a girl, and who had heard, in the way the poor hear everything, that the Vale woman took on hands that nobody else would, and who stood in the yard and said flatly that she was strong as any two men and would work for her keep and her learning, and asked no wage till there was one to give. And Esther looked at the great capable hands of her, and thought of the 100 weights of loam and the strickle to be steadied, and said she might stay. And behind Peg, a day later, came Nan, who was Peg's opposite in the body, a thin, small, watchful girl of 15 or so, with quick, dark eyes that went round a place and priced it before she gave it a word, a girl the heath called sly, and Esther, who had herself been called unnatural often enough by people who mistook a quiet watching for a cold heart, knew at a glance was nothing of the kind, but was only careful, and had the one gift past price in that trade, which is that she saw. Nan saw where a thing was out of true before it was out of true to anyone else's eye. She would watch Esther clay a joint and say nothing, and then reach in and set right with one finger a small wrongness that Esther herself had not yet caught, and Esther, marking it, thought that here perhaps, though it was far too soon to say it even to herself, was the one of them she might one day trust with the black book. No master in the county would have taken those two girls, and no master in the county would have taken old Simon Croft either, half-deaf and past his hard-work years, who had kept the yard swept out of grief the whole cold 12-month, and now stood at the furnace mouth again where he had stood 40 years, deaf as he was reading the fire by its color and its breath, because his ears had gone, and his eyes had not, feeding it and watching it and telling her, in his flat, too loud deaf man's voice, when it was drawing sweet and when it sulked, and no master would have thought a broken solitary artillery captain worth much to a foundry either, but it was Captain Marsh who was the fourth of them, and it was Captain Marsh most of all who made them, out of 4 leavings and a beaten woman, a crew. He did not come with comfort, which she could not have borne, and he did not come with pity, which she would have sent him down the lane for. He came in the bad evenings on his big, quiet gray, when the work had gone wrong and the tackle had carried away, and he mended the tackle. That was his whole manner of standing by her, and it was exactly the right one. When the crane rope frayed and parted and dropped 100 weight of loam into the pit and undid a day's building, it was the captain who spliced her a new fall out of good rope of his own and hung it right. When the gantry that swung the cope racked and started at a joint, it was the captain who came down of a wet night with his own tools and his old gunfounder's knowledge of heavy tackle and heavier weights, and got under it with his lame leg braced in the mud, and trussed and pinned it true with his own hands, saying almost nothing the whole while, and drank a mug of what she had by the fire after, and rode home in the dark, and it was understood between them, without a word of it ever being said, that this was not a man rescuing a woman, but one competent creature who could not bear to see good work go down for want of a sound rope holding out his hand to another across a stretch of bad ground, and asking nothing back, and being told nothing he had not earned. She could sit with him by the reviving fire and not fill the silence, which she could do with almost no one living. And if there was a thing growing between the two of them in those bad nights, it was growing the slow way true things grow, under the ground, out of the light. And neither of them looked at it yet, and I will not look at it for them. So the crew was made. In the very week they were all of them counted beaten, and it was on the tail of that week, timing it as he timed everything to the hour of her lowest, that her cousin came in person. He came softly, in a good chaise left at the top of the lane where the mud began, and he picked his way down through the clay in his good boots, a portly, high-colored, well-fed man in broadcloth, with his watch chain across the swell of him, and his soft pink hands turning and turning the seals at his fob. And he stood in the yard and looked about him, at the dead proving bell in its corner, and the thin coke, and the two rough girls, and the half-blind old man, and the whole poor beaten shape of the place. And he let his face fill up slow with a grave and gentle sorrow, and he called her Cousin Esther. And he said that he had not been able to rest for thinking of her down here in the cold and the shame of it, that he had heard of the bell, of course he had heard, all the county had heard, and that it grieved him to the very heart to see his own blood set against a thing that had now, surely, in her own good sense, proved itself past her, that he begged her as a kinsman and not as anything else to let it go now, before she spent the last of her strength and her name and her grandfather's little money upon a folly that must break her, and to take the fair price, the generous price that he would still, out of nothing but family feeling, be glad to lay in her hand this very day for the whole of it, foundry and cottage and cold pit and all, so that she might walk out of this misery with money and her health and never stand under the county's pity again. And think, he said, dropping his voice kind and low, think of the danger of it besides. For even were the thing possible, even could she by some wonder raise the bell, would she truly hang a doubtful casting of her own untried making in that tower over the heads of living men, and carry the risk of it on her soul, when a word from her now would put the work into safe and sworn and practiced hands? He had wound his own rumor into his mercy so smoothly that a softer soul might have taken the poison for the cure. And Esther Vale, who had heard him out to the last honeyed syllable, standing before her grandfather's dead hearth in her scorched apron, with the loam not yet washed from her scarred forearms, looked at him then the way she looked at a suspect bar of metal, full and level and unhurried, reading his color and finding it, as she had found it in a cold attorney's room weeks before. Cold all the way through and false at the heart, and she said only, and she did not raise her voice at all, that she thanked her cousin for the trouble of his long ride in the wet, and that her health was very good, and that the bell that rang dead had rung dead because it was cast wrong and in haste and of poor metal, which faults were hers to mend and would be mended, and that she had signed to cast the great bell and would cast it, or fail at it with her own hands and no others, and that when he wished to speak with her further he might do it through the attorneys as her grandfather's will provided, and not else. And she said it so plain and so quiet, and left him so little edge to catch a quarrel on, that the sorrow came off his face by degrees like frost coming off a warming pane, and left showing underneath it, for one bare unguarded moment, the true thing beneath, the flat pale look of a man doing a sum and not liking the answer. And then he put the mask back over it, and said he was very sorry indeed, that she would take it so, and that she must not say hereafter that he had not warned her in kindness when the ruin of it came down upon her. And he turned and picked his careful way back up the mud to his waiting chaise, and she stood in the door of the beaten shop and watched him go, as she had watched the captain go on other evenings, and marked, as she always marked. The whole difference between the two of them in the manner of a going away. Then she turned back into the cold shop, where the dead bell stood in its corner, and the little crew waited by the low fire, and she did not yet know how she would find the coke, or the tin, or the hands, or the honest metal, and she did not yet know how she would read the last of the black book that held the lost scale and the silver receipt, and she did not yet know 100 things she would have to know before Whitsun. But she knew the one thing that mattered, which was that a fire banked right down to its last red heart in the black of the night is not a fire gone out, whatever a man leaning over it in the dark may choose to believe. And she had banked hers, and it was time now, past time, to blow it up again. Now the world had had its say, and there is a mercy hidden in that, though it does not feel like mercy at the time, for the world's saying is only a wind, and a wind, howl how it will, cannot lay a single course of brick nor sweep one true line of loam. And Esther Vale had let the whole close talk itself hoarse over her, and had turned her cousin's money down to his soft pink face. And now there was nothing left standing between her and the thing itself, but the thing itself. She came back through the foundry gate on the first gray morning after the refusal, and drew it shut behind her on its dragging hinge, and she stood a moment in the middle of the cold yard with her breath smoking, and listened to the one sound the world had not been able to take from her, which was the sound of nothing at all, no roar in the furnace mouth, no clack of the bellows lever, no long sweet ring of trued metal walking out across the yard the way it had walked when she was a child, the particular deep silence of a works gone dead, that she had come there, God helping her, to break. And I want you to understand, before we go into the labor of it, that from this morning forward the tale changes its nature. For we have had the reading of the will, and we have had the sneering, and we have had the slow cold war of the man from Ashcombe. And all of that was other people doing things to her. And now, for a long turn of the year, it is going to be her doing things to the dead iron and the dead earth, one patient thing after another, and nobody rescuing anybody. And I would not have you grow impatient in this stretch, for this is where the whole matter is truly won or lost, in the part that no ballad ever troubles to sing. She began where a founder must always begin, which is not with the great work but with the fire, for a cold furnace will cast you nothing but disappointment. And the Vale furnace, when she came to it clear-eyed and unsentimental in the raw light, was a sorry ruin of a thing. It was a reverberatory furnace, built the good old way with the fire kept apart from the metal, so that the flame is drawn up over a low wall of brick, the fire bridge, the founders call it, and beats along under the arched roof and folds down upon the charge and licks it molten without ever touching it with the fuel itself. And that is a clever, cunning kind of fire. But a reverberatory furnace is a living thing that must be kept, and this one had stood a year and more with the weather in it, and its roof had sagged and cracked where the frost had got into the old mortar, and half the fire bridge had spalled away into rubble, and the tap hole through which the metal should run was choked with a black, glassy plug of the last melt that had died in it, and there were rat droppings in the ash pit, and a stitch of green weed growing bold as brass in the crack of the hearth. A lesser heart would have looked at that and heard the guild's laughter as plain prophecy. Esther looked at it and rolled her sleeve past the old pale burned scar on her forearm and said to old Croft, who stood beside her turning his cap in his two hands, that they would have it down to the good brick and build it up again true, and she said it in the flat voice of a woman pricing a job, not making a vow. They took a fortnight over the furnace, she and Simon Croft and the two girls, and it was cold, filthy, patient work, with nothing beautiful in it. Croft was half deaf, as I have told you, and grief and the year of idleness had bent him. But the moment his hands were laid on the warm business of fire brick and fire clay, a kind of youngness came back into them. And it was worth a great deal to watch the old man remember through his fingers what his ears could no longer be told. He could not always hear Esther's word, but he could feel the truth of a thing, and he would lay his palm flat against a new set brick and shake his white head, and they would take it up and set it again, and only then would he nod. They pulled down the sagged roof arch, and turned the old brick, and picked the sound from the shattered, and set it again over a centering of wet boards, and they built the fire bridge back up square, and rammed the new hearth bed with a black sticky fettling of old ground brick and clay, and beat it with the flat of the rammers until it rang dull and dense under the blow. And Esther herself cut the choke out of the tap hole with a long chisel and dressed it clean and true, so that the metal, when its hour came, would find a smooth road out. And here is the first place I must tell you plainly of Captain Marsh. For he came up the lane on the third day of it with a cart, and on the cart under a tarpaulin was the second load of copper he had promised, and, without a word said, a keg of good fire clay, and a bundle of new iron cramps for the casing. And he unloaded it himself with his one grave courtesy, and did not once say she should not be doing this, nor that a woman should not, nor ask was she quite sure, which are the 3 sentences she had grown so weary of that she could have wept to be spared them. He was a widowed man, and a former founder of guns turned to the gentler founding of bells and the hanging of them. And he had a stillness on him that some took for coldness, and that Esther, who was herself made mostly of stillness, read rightly the first week as the quiet of a man who had learned the hard way that most words are wasted. And when the new roof of the furnace would not draw, and the smoke rolled back sullen into the shop, it was Marsh who climbed the crazy old flue in the dusk and found where a jackdaw's year of nesting had blocked the throat of it, and cleared it with his arm to the shoulder in the soot, and came down black as a collier, and only said, dryly, that the bird had built better than it knew, and that the furnace would draw now. And it drew. But a founder does not live by fire alone. And while the days went to the brick and the clay, the nights, the long cold spring nights with a single dip candle guttering, went to the oak chest and the cipher, and this, though it made no smoke and lifted no weight, was the harder half of the labor by far, and it was the half nobody could help her with. Not Croft, not Marsh, not the girls, not one soul living, because her grandfather Amos Vale had written his whole life's knowledge in a private hand that he had taught to no man and to only one child, and that child sat now alone at the cottage table night after night reading her inheritance out of the dark. You will remember what lay in that chest, for it is the beating secret of the whole tale. The bell scales, which is to say the exact profiles, the true curve and thickness at every point from the flaring lip of the sound bow up the long waist to the shoulder and the crown, that make a bell, when it is struck, ring not one confused clang but a chord, the deep humming note that lies under all, and the prime, and the sweet minor third above it, and the fifth, and the strike note that stands over the whole, all in their right and ancient accord, so that the bell is in tune not with any other bell but, more wonderfully, with itself. And beside the scales lay the receipts, the recipes, the exact marriage of metals that gave a Vale bell that one thing no rival house had ever stolen from them. The tone that had made the name. The silver, silken, singing quality that folk 50 miles off would name without being told the founder, the way you know a voice through a wall. And both of these, the scale for the great tenor and the receipt for its metal, her grandfather had, in the last confusion of his fever, left ciphered and unclarified, half in symbols she knew, and half in a shorthand of his own last invention, as though the old man's mind, going out like a coal, had banked its most precious heat under ash where only patience could rake it out again. So she raked. Night upon night she sat and matched the symbols she was sure of against the ones she was not, and read a line, and doubted it, and read it against another. And I will not pretend to you that it came to her in a flash of grace, for it did not. It came the slow, honest way, the way true things mostly come, a little at a time and against resistance, with 2 steps forward and 1 back, and a whole wasted evening now and then over a mark she had read as a numeral that turned out to be a fold in the old paper. And as she worked there would rise up in her, unbidden, the memory of the old man himself, his big soot-blackened hands moving over these very drawings by firelight when she was a mite too small to see over the table's edge, his deep, slow voice telling her, long before she had her catechism, as I told you at the first, that a bell was not cast. It was tuned before ever it was poured, that all the tuning that mattered was in the shape, that a fool could make a lump of bronze that banged, and only a veil could make one that sang, and that the sang was here, in the curve, in the thickness, in the holy proportion of the parts, and she would come out of the memory to find the candle burned an inch lower, and her own cheeks wet and one more line of the cipher standing clear. By the turning of the month she had it. She had the great scale whole, the tenor's true profile laid out fair in her own steadier hand, and she had the receipt beside it, and it was, as such deep secrets so often are, at once perfectly simple and perfectly impossible to have guessed, the old proportion of the founders, so many parts of pure red copper to so many of white block tin, but held to a nicety, to a hair, where other men worked rough and let it fall as it would, and past that the one veil grace note, a bare whisper of fine silver thrown to the melt, not enough to matter to any assayer's scale. Enough, her grandfather had written in his dry way in the margin, to put the moon into it. She read that line by the guttering candle, and she laughed out loud alone in the cottage. One short surprised sound, half grief and half joy, for it was so exactly, so unbearably him. Now knowing a thing, and proving it are 2 countries with a wide cold sea between them, and Esther Vale was far too much her grandfather's child to carry the great tenor's whole fortune upon a scale and a receipt she had only read. She meant to prove them small before she staked them large. So before ever she went down into the casting pit, she made herself a little proving piece, a plain handbell no bigger than a quart pot, and she made its mold to the true scale, brought down small, and she melted her first honest charge to the recovered receipt, the copper and the tin held exact, and the whisper of silver thrown in at the last, and she poured it, and she waited the day for it to cool, and broke the mold, and struck it. And it must be told, for it is only fair, and it is the truth of all real work, that her very first trials had not gone sweet, earlier, in the bad weeks. Before she had the cipher hole, she had cast 2 small bells out of guesswork and grief, and the first had come up dull as a cracked crock, a dead thumping thing with no life in it at all, and the second, cast to a stolen half-guess of the alloy, had rung, but rung sour, rung with the third gone flat, and a nasty wolf in the note that set the teeth on edge. A bell that a kind man would call a bell, and an honest ear would call a lie. She had kept both of those dead bells on the shelf where she could see them, not out of any love of punishing herself, but because a founder ought to keep her failures in her eye. And every trial she now made, she made against the silent judgment of those 2. But this bell, this little handbell cast to the recovered scale and the recovered metal, this one, when she took it up warm from the broken loam and held it out on her 2 fingers by its crown and struck it once with the small hammer, This one sang. It sang the way the memory of her grandfather's shop had sung. It put out a round silver note that stood up clean in the cold air of the shop and hung there and spread, the hum coming up warm underneath it, and the strike note riding sweet on top, all of a piece, all in accord. A small voice, but a true one, an unmistakably, gloriously a veil voice. And Peg, who was sturdy and not given to fancies, put down the rammer she was cleaning and stood stock still. And old Croft, who could scarcely hear thunder, laid his palm flat against the bench and felt the singing come up through the wood into his hand and turned his face away so the girls should not see it work. Esther struck it a second time to be sure the first was no accident, and it answered as true as the first, and she set it down very gently on the bench beside its two dead brothers. And she said only, well then, in the flat pricing voice, but her hand, when she took it away from the little bell, was not quite steady, and that was the truest word spoken in the shop that day. After that there was no more question of whether, only of how long and how hard, and the great work went down into the pit. And I wish I could make you see the pit as it was, that deep brick-lined well sunk in the floor of the shop, with the crane and its gantry standing over it like a gallows. Because the making of a great bell's mold is one of the last of the true mysteries, and it is nearly gone out of the world now. And it went like this. First she built the core, which is the shape of the hollow inside of the bell, and she built it up of old brick laid dry and rough in a beehive dome on the pit floor, and over the rough brick she laid the loam. And here you must know that Founder's loam is no common mud but a living, worked stuff, sand and clay and horse dung and the cut hair of cattle, all trodden and tempered together until it will bind and yet breathe out the steam of its own wetness in the fire, and not tear itself apart. And she swept that loam true to the inner curve of the bell with the strickle board. The strickle, or the crook, or the sweep, name it as you like, is a plain stout board with one edge cut away exactly to the profile of the shape it must make, mounted to turn upon an iron spindle set plumb in the center of the pit. And the founder lays on the wet loam, a little proud of the line, and then swings the board slowly round upon its spindle, round and round. And the cut edge shears the loam away and leaves behind it, as the board comes round, the one true turned surface that no hand, however skilled, could shape by eye. A whole smooth sweep of curve got from a flat board and a patient arm, and there was in Esther's slow swinging of that board through the wet loam, in the dark of the pit by lantern light, something so like a priest's slow motion at an altar that Marsh, watching from the pit's edge on an evening he had come with more copper, took off his hat without seeming to know he had done it. When the core was swept true and dried hard with a gentle fire built inside its own dome, she built over it the false bell, the second of the three and the strangest, for it is a bell made only to be destroyed. Over the finished core she laid a coat of loam and tallow built up to the exact thickness the true bell was to have, swept true again with a second strickle cut, this time to the outer profile, so that now there stood in the pit a perfect dumb bell of loam, the very size and shape of the tenor that was to be, lacking only its voice, and upon this false bell she did the fine work, the writing. For a great bell wears its words about its shoulder, an inscription band running clean round below the crown, and Esther modeled the letters and the founder's stops in wax and set them into the false bell's shoulder one by one, reversed, sunk, so that they should come up proud on the finished metal, the year of our Lord, and the name of the cathedral, and the old founder's motto that the tenor was to carry. And then, at the seam of the band, where the last word met the first, she did the thing that I have been waiting the whole tale to tell you of, and that will come back at the very end to decide everything, though not one soul then living knew it but herself. She pressed into the wax, small in the place where the eye slides past, because it has already read the words. Her grandfather's own founder's mark, the little veil device of a bell hung true within its frame that had stood on every good bell the house had made for 60 years. And then, hard beside it, smaller still, so small you would need to know they were there before your finger could find them, she pressed her own 2 initials, EV, into the wax with a fine bodkin. Her secret, her signature, her hand set forever and hidden inside the metal where no forger's story could ever reach to take it out again. She told nobody. She did not tell Croft, and she did not tell the girls, and she did not then tell Marsh. She smoothed the wax over so the marks lay quiet, and she went on to the cope. The cope is the third and the outermost, the great outer casing that takes the shape of the outside of the bell, and she built it up over the finished false bell in coat upon coat of finer and finer loam, each coat let dry before the next. The whole slowly thickened and then bound and cased about with a cage of the iron cramps Marsh had brought, and roped with hay bands, and daubed again, until there stood in the pit a thing like a great blind iron-bound thundercloud with a bell hidden in the heart of it. And then came the held breath of the whole business, the lifting, for the cope must be raised straight up off the false bell without a jar, hung true from the crane. And it was here that Marsh's rigging was worth its weight in the very metal they were saving for he had slung and hoisted heavy, awkward masses all his working life, and he set the tackle and eased the great cope up off its seat by inches, by breaths, Esther's hand and his own upon the guide ropes together, and neither of them saying a word, because there was no word that would help. Only the creak of the gear, and the small grunt of the old crane taking the strain, and it came up whole. Then they broke away the false bell, that perfect loam bell that had never rung and never would, chipped and swept it all away down to the true dried core, so that its careful shape now survived only as a hollow, a bell-shaped emptiness, printed in reverse on the inside of the cope and waiting round the outside of the core. And then they lowered the great cope down again over the core, dead true, so that between the two, between the outer cope and the inner core, there was left that thin curved shell of empty space, the exact and only shape of the bell that was to be, waiting for the metal to come and be a voice. They rammed it home then and sealed it down. They set the whole married mold firm on the pit floor over its running gate, and they filled the pit in around it and above it with earth, ramming the earth hard about the mold on every side and over its crown until it was buried whole, a made thing put back into the ground to be borne out of it. For a great bell is not cast in the open air, but deep in the packed earth that holds the mold against the terrible outward push of the metal that would else split the strongest cope like an eggshell. And when it was buried, there began the last and quietest and most dangerous labor of all, and the one that frightened Esther more than fire or falling gear ever did. And that was the drying. For there is one enemy that will destroy a buried mold more surely than any spite her cousin could buy, and that enemy is damp, a single-held pocket of hidden wet, deep in the loam where no eye can find it, that will meet the run of molten bronze and flash in an instant to steam and blow the whole casting up out of the pit in a spray of fire that has killed founders in their own shops within the memory of men then living. Against that one killing chance there is no cure but patience and slow heat. And so for days on end she kept slow banked fires, breathing their gentle warmth down into the buried mold through its own vents. Never hot, never hurried. A low, steady, coaxing heat that walked the wet up out of the deep loam a little at a time. And she watched the vents for the faint bloom of steam and read it as she read all heat, by eye, and kept the fires so, banked and patient, day into night into day, until the breath that came up from the mold came up dry and clean, and the loam, when she probed it, was baked as hard and warm and sound all through as a loaf an hour out of the oven. It was Marsh who sat the worst of those nights with her, the two of them on upturned kegs at the pit's edge with the low fire glow on their faces, feeding the banked fire and saying next to nothing, and I want to be very plain about what did and did not pass between those two in that firelight, because it is easy to tell it wrong. There was no rescue in it, and there was no pity in it. He did not sit there because she was a woman who needed a man by her. She had proved past any need of proving that she needed no man to do her work. He sat there because it was a great work, and he loved a great work. And he had found, late and quietly, the one other soul in that whole cathedral city who saw the thing whole as he saw it. And she let him sit there for the very same reason. And somewhere across those long banked fire nights, the thing between them stopped being a founder and her copper merchant and became two equals keeping a hard watch together, shoulder to shoulder and eye to eye, without one word of it spoken aloud. Which is, I have come to think, the truest and the rarest way that such a thing is ever built at all. And so I will leave them, for this turn of the tale, at the very lip of the thing they had labored all the cold spring to reach. The furnace stood rebuilt and drawing sweet and hungry in the shop. The proving bell sang on the bench where any doubter might come and strike it. Down in the filled and rammed pit the great mold lay buried, sealed, and bone dry, the true tenor's shape, waiting hollow in the earth with the veil mark and the hidden initials pressed secret in the wax of its shoulder. And ranged and weighed and ready on the shop floor stood the charge itself, the mountain of it. The ruddy copper Marsh had carted load by load, and the bright block tin she had gathered dear and short against her cousin's cornering, and the small guarded parcel of fine silver for the last grace of the melt. All of it weighed to the receipt's exact hair and stacked ready to go into the fire. Everything she had, everything she was, everything her grandfather had banked under the ash for her to rake out again. Come down now to one single thing that could not be tried small, nor taken back, nor done twice. One melt, one pour, one run of white metal into the buried dark. She stood in the shop door in the last light and looked at the ready charge and the sleeping furnace and the sealed pit, and she did not pray, exactly, being not much of a hand at it. She only stood and read the cold metal one more time with her level gray eyes and made her fires ready for the morning. What happened when at last that fire was lit and driven, and the white metal run down into the earth, the long night of the melt and the terror of the pour, and whether the mud held or the damp had truly gone or her cousin had one last spite left to spend, that is the next thing, and it is a great thing, and it must have its own telling. But on this evening, with the whole of it staked and waiting and not one blow of it yet struck, Esther Vale banked her fire and went in. Now there are labors in this world that a man or a woman may take up and lay down again as the light fails, and come back to fresh in the morning with nothing lost by the resting. And then there are labors that once begun cannot be halted or slept upon or done in halves. That must be carried straight through from the first spark to the last in one unbroken breath or not attempted at all. And the casting of a great bell is of that second and more terrible kind. For the metal does not care that you are weary, and the fire does not keep, and there is 1 hour and one only in a whole month of preparing when everything you have made and mended and reckoned and prayed over stands ready together at the one instant, and if you miss that hour by the turning of a glass you have lost it, and all of it, and there is no beginning again before the feast. Esther Vale knew that as she knew her own two hands, for her grandfather had told it her 100 times over the years in 100 different words, that the mold-making is the wife's long patience, and the melt is the husband's one night's courage, and a founder must be married to both or he is nothing. And so when the mold stood finished and sealed down in the black of the casting pit, with the loam gone hard as biscuit and the drying fires banked and drawn, and the great heap of copper and the smaller bright pigs of block tin stood weighed and stacked by the furnace mouth under Croft's old sacking, she did not rush at it. She waited 3 days. She waited for a dry spell, watching the sky the way she had watched the wet gray glass in the attorney's chamber all those weeks before, reading the weather off the moor the way she read heat off metal, until the wind came round steady from the northeast, and the damp went out of the air and out of the yard, and out, she trusted, of the last hidden pore of the buried mold. And on the evening of the third dry day, with the sun going down red and clean behind the ash trees, and a hard, bright star already stood over the tower of the cathedral across the water meadows, she said to Croft, "We light her tonight." And the old man took off his cap for a moment as though a name had been spoken in church, and put it on again, and went to lay the first fire. And I want you to see the yard as it was that night, for you will not see its like again. And there were not 4 souls in all of England who would have wagered a clipped farthing on what those 5 within it were about to do. The Vale foundry stood black against a sky gone deep blue, and then indigo, and then to the true blue-black of a cold, clear spring night. And in the midst of that dark, the great reverberatory furnace that Esther had rebuilt brick by patient brick began to breathe. Croft fed her slow at the first, coaxing, the way you wake a strong horse that has stood too long in the stall, small coke and dry billet, and then coke, and more coke, and the drought took hold and drew, and the flame that at the first crept red and sullen along the low arched roof of the furnace and licked down upon the metal in the shallow, reverberating bed began by the hour to change its nature and its color, and Esther stood at the working hole with the long shade held to her eyes and read it. For that, you will remember, was the whole of her gift and her grandfather's before her, that where another founder kept a boy running to the barometer, or trusted to the clock or the smell of the fume or the mere say-so of his own tired blood, Esther Vale could look into the white mouth of a furnace and tell you the heat of it to within the breadth of a hair by the color alone, could tell the dull red from the cherry, and the cherry from the orange, and the orange from the straw, and the straw from the clean singing white that is hotter than any word we have for it, and bell metal, which is no soft and forgiving stuff, but a hard high bronze of copper and tin that must be driven far past the melting of common brass, or it will pour thick and dead and cold-hearted and ruin all. Bell metal wants that white, wants to be brought up past its melting, and held there glowing and alive and thin as new milk, and only an eye that will not lie to itself can bring it there, and know it, and hold it, and not flinch. They put the copper in first, when she gave the word, for the copper is the stubborn one, and must be well begun before ever the tin comes near it. And Peg and Nan and Croft and the captain fed it in the ordered way she had drilled into them a dozen times over, so that no hand should fumble in the dark and the heat. The great red bars going down onto the bed of the furnace in through the charging hole, and the flame closing over them. And the metal that had been solid and gray and cold began, over the slow hours, to slump and sag and lose its edges and run together into a bright shivering pool that trembled under the beating flame like something alive and unwilling. It is a long night's work, that, and a hot one, and I will not pretend to you that it was quiet or clean or in any way like the pretty picture the word founding may raise in a mind that has never stood a melt, for the heat came off the furnace mouth in a wall you could lean upon, and the faces of the four who tended it ran with sweat, and went red as the metal in the glare, and blackened again in the dark between the flarings. And the roar of the drought was such that they spoke by signs and by shouts close to the ear, and the sparks went up the black chimney in long red rivers and out over the sleeping meadows toward the town that had written them off for beaten. And through it all Esther moved from the furnace mouth to the pit head and back, reading, the shade to her eyes at the working hole, and then her bare palm laid flat an inch off the sealed mold to feel that it stayed warm and dry and dead hush, with no whisper of steam in it. And back again, and her grandfather's cipher book open on the bench under a stone, with the copper and tin receipt marked, though she had it by heart now and did not need to read it, and had not needed to for weeks. And when the copper was fully run and lay in the bed a heaving white-orange lake, then and only then came the moment that her grandfather had marked in the cipher with a small drawn crescent like a young moon, the going in of the tin. And this is the true mystery, and the innermost secret of the whole trade, and the thing the guild had sworn no woman living could hold in her head and her hand. For the tin is quick and eager and low-melting, where the copper is slow, and if you put it in too soon or too hot or too fast, it will flare and burn and go off up the chimney as a bitter white fume, and leave your bell poor and brittle and false-toned. And the getting of it in at the one right instant, at the one right heat, in the one right manner, pulled down under the surface out of the air's reach on the end of a long iron, and held there while it married with the copper, that was the whole difference between a veil bell that would sing for 400 years with a silver silken voice that raised the hair on a listener's neck, and a common founder's bell that would clang like a struck bucket and be cracked and recast within the lifetime of the man who paid for it. Esther brought the tin in herself. She would let no other hand do it. She read the lake to the exact clean straw white she wanted, a hair below the singing white, and she gave the word, and the bright pigs of block tin went down under the surface on the polling iron in the order and at the pace she called, and the metal took them and shivered and drank them down. And where a careless founder would have had it flare, she had it marry quiet. And then she had Croft plunge the pole of green applewood down into the melt so that the sap of it boiled off in a rush of bubbles up through the bronze and scoured the badness out of it, the way her grandfather had taught. And the whole lake seethed and worked, and then went smooth and bright and heavy and still. And she took the long skimmer and drew off the scum, the gray gold dross that gathers on any melt like scum on a pot, drew it off clean to the bright mirror beneath, and looked into that mirror of molten bell metal glowing straw white in the black furnace, and knew it was right, and knew it the way you know a true note is true, with no argument in it and no appeal. But I have kept a thing from you, for it was kept from her, near enough until it was almost too late, and that is that they were not 5 in the yard that night after all, but 6. For the cousin who had poached her men and cornered her metal and set his soft, slow rumor running through the close that a woman's bell would burst in the tower and brain a ringer, the cousin had not left it there, and would not leave it while there was breath in the enterprise to stop. And he had learned, by whatever crooked ear he kept in that country, that she meant to cast, and knew as well as any founder living that a melt is the 1 hour when all a rival's month of work stands naked to a single stroke of harm, when a handful of the wrong thing dropped in the metal, or a splash of water where water must never come, can undo in the space of a breath what no man could undo with a hammer in a week. And so there was a man come over the low back wall of the yard in the dark of that night, down among the loam benches and the stacked flasks where the firelight did not reach, a lean, hard-faced fellow that Peg would afterwards swear was one of the very journeymen the cousin had bought away from her at the start. And he lay quiet there in the black a long while, with the roar of the furnace covering him, watching, and in his coat he carried two things: a stoppered stone bottle of water and a fistful of common lead. For you must understand what those two poor cheap things could do to see the size of what was very nearly done. The lead, dropped soft into that white bronze at the last, would not flare nor show, would sink and melt and hide and spread all through the metal unseen, and it would poison the whole cast, would make the bell heavy-tongued and dull and dead in the voice forever, so that it might come whole out of the pit, and hang true in the tower, and ring out on the great morning nothing but a flat, coarse, mocking clank before all the county. And the ruin would look like her ruin, her poor woman's failure, and no man would ever know a stranger's hand was in it. And the water was worse, and quicker, and meaner, for a splash of water flung down the runner into the buried mold, or into the very stream of the pour, turns in one instant to steam trapped under tons of metal. And steam, so caught, does not hiss. It explodes. It blows the molten bronze back up out of the pit in a roaring gout that will take the face and the arms and the life off whoever stands nearest, and whoever stood nearest that night at the pouring was to be Esther Vale. He waited for the pour. That was his cunning, and it was very nearly the end of her, for at the pour every eye in that yard would be bent down into the pit, and every hand full and every soul stretched to the one act, and a man might step from the shadows in that half instant and do his work and be gone over the wall before the screaming started. But he had reckoned without old Simon Croft, and here I will ask you to remember the old furnaceman as he was first shown you, half deaf, grief-slowed, kept on more from mercy than from need, sweeping a dead yard out of love for a dead master, for it was Croft, who could scarcely hear you shout your own name in his ear, that saved the bell and the woman both, and he saved them by his eyes, because a man who has lost the one sense grows sharp past telling in the rest. And Croft for 50 years had watched the shadows of that yard by firelight, and knew every honest shape a shadow ought to make there, and he saw one that was wrong. He saw, low down by the third loam bench where no shape should move, a darkness gather and rise as the furnace flared, and he did not shout, for shouting was the one thing he could not trust. He crossed the yard at his old stiff run without a word, and took the man from behind at the very instant the fellow started up out of the dark, with the stone bottle already swung back in his fist to fling, and they went down together among the flasks in a tangle, the old man and the young, and the bottle burst on the cobbles, and its water ran away harmless and steaming a yard short of the pit, and the fistful of lead scattered bright and useless into the black, where it could do no hurt to any honest metal, and Peg, turning at the noise, was on the two of them in 3 strides, with a moulder's rammer swung up in both hands, and the captain a step behind her. And the lean man saw the size of what was on him, and tore free of Croft's old grip, and went back over the wall, the way he had come, with Peg's rammer taking a chip out of the coping an inch from his heel, and was gone into the meadow dark, and did not come again. And here is the thing I most want you to carry away from that night, for it is the whole heart of the woman. Esther Vale did not turn round. She heard it. The burst bottle, the shout, the scuffle at her back among the benches. She heard it all, and she did not so much as glance from the mouth of the furnace, because the metal was coming to its heat, and the metal would not wait. And she had learned in a hard school that the founder who takes her eye off the melt to see who is screaming behind her loses the melt and the bell end, everything, and that the surest way to make her enemy a present of the whole was to let him frighten her hands. So she stood, And she read the white climbing lake, and she trusted the good souls at her back to keep her back for her. And they did. And only when it was over and the man gone, and Croft got to his feet nursing a wrenched old shoulder, and Peg stood over the empty wall, breathing like a bellows. Only then, without turning her head, did Esther say into the roar, in a voice they barely heard and never forgot, "Is my mold dry?" And Croft went and laid his own scarred palm to the loam, and felt it warm and sound and dry as a loaf, and called back that it was. And she said, "Then we pour." They tapped her at the low black turn of the night, in that dead cold hour that is neither the old day nor the new. Esther read the metal one last time, the clean straw white running thin and bright and alive, hot enough and not 1 degree past, and she gave Croft the word, and Croft drove the bar into the tap hole and knocked out the clay bod, and the bell metal came. It came in a rod of white fire, a smooth, unbroken bar of light bent down the launder and along the runner and down the ingate into the mouth of the buried mold, so bright in that black yard that it threw every face into hard gold and every shadow leaping up the walls. And it ran, and it went on running, pouring down and down into the earth, into the great hollow shape they had made, and could no longer see, filling it from the bottom up in a rising column no eye could watch. And every danger that a founder fears in all the world stood live and present in that half-minute together. For the mold might yet blow, if one hidden bead of damp had lived through all her drying, and take them all, and the metal might chill too fast against the loam and leave a cold shut, a seam where the rising bronze had met itself and failed to knit, a hidden crack built into the very substance of the bell that would show as a dead buzz or split the hole in the tower a year on, and the trapped air might not win up out of the risers in time and leave a blowhole, a pocket of nothing in the metal where the note should live. And there was nothing now, nothing in the world, that any of them could do to mend any of it. For the pour once begun is a thing you have loosed and cannot call back. And Esther Vale stood at the pit head with the white light on her still face and her burn-scarred arms bare, and her hands hanging open and empty at her sides, and did the hardest thing in all her hard trade, which is to have done everything and now do nothing, and watch and wait. The mold gulped and drank. The risers filled and stood, one after another, bright pips of white metal winking up out of the black earth to say the great cavity below was full to its crown, and the last of the stream ran thin and stopped, and Croft stopped the tap, and the metal in the risers dulled slowly from white to straw, to orange to a deep sullen cherry, cooling, taking, and no gout of steam came, and no dull crack sounded up out of the ground, and the mold did not blow, and the bell was cast, though whether it was cast whole and true, or cast dead, and ruined not one soul on this earth could yet say, and would not know for days. For that is the last cruelty of the trade, that after the one wild night comes the long dumb waiting, and the waiting is worse than the fire. A great bell cannot be hurried in its cooling any more than in its making. Wrench it from the earth too soon. Break into the pit while the metal is still red-hearted in its loam, and the sudden air will crack it as surely as the frost cracks a crock of water, and undo the whole. So they banked the pit and covered it and set a watch, and went, the 5 of them, gray-faced and hollow, and stumbling with the tiredness that comes down after such a night like a felled tree, to sleep the clock round, and then they waited, while the buried bell gave up its heat to the Sussex earth an hour at a time, a day and a night, and a day and a night and a day. 5 days by Esther's reckoning off the cipher. 5 days in which the whole close across the water believed the thing was either done or botched, and no man could tell which. And the cousin let his smile go about the town, and Esther Vale said very little to anybody, and slept badly, and stood a great deal at the covered pit, with her hand flat on the cooling ground, as though she could feel the note waking in it. And on the 6th morning they opened her. They took away the covering, and dug down, and broke the great cope free in careful pieces, the outer shell of hard loam falling away in slabs from about the shape it had held, and lifted off the last of it. And there in the pit, cool at last and gray-black and whole, stood the bell. Croft rigged the crane, and they took the strain slow, all of them, and the captain's block and tackle and his patient hands upon the guide rope, and the great tenor bell of the cathedral rose up out of the earth that had made it, turning slow on the chain, shedding crumbs of burnt loam, and swung clear and hung there in the gray morning light for them all to see. Whole, unbroken, no gape nor flaw, nor cold shut showing anywhere upon it. The long clean sweep of its side running down to the thickened sound bow and the flaring lip. The inscription band standing proud about its shoulder with the founder's mark struck into it, and hidden small among the ornament, where only a knowing eye would ever think to look, the little linked letters of her own name that she had pressed secretly into the wax. Peg cried, and was not ashamed of it. Nan laughed. Croft took off his cap. And Esther Vale walked round the hung bell once, slowly, reading it with her eyes, and then with the flat of her scarred hand laid against the cold metal, and then she took up a small hammer and she struck it, once, there in the yard, untuned and raw as it was. And it spoke. It spoke rough, for an untuned bell is a promise, and not yet a keeping, but under the roughness, low and clean and unmistakable to the one ear in that county that could hear such things, ran the silver, ran the silken singing undertone, the Vale voice, alive in it and only waiting to be freed. But a bell out of the pit, you must understand, is not yet a true bell. No more than a rough cast is a finished statue. And the freeing of that voice is the last and finest and most exacting of all the founder's arts, and the one that seals the whole. For the note's hidden in a great bell, and there are many, not one. A bell being the strangest and richest of all made voices, do not come from the casting already in their perfect accord, but must be searched out and shaved true. And this Esther did now over the slow patient days that followed. The bell set up mouth upward, and turning slow while she cut and pared at the metal of its inner wall with a keen tool, taking a whisper of bronze here and a whisper there. For a bell holds within it a hum and a strike note and the ringing partials above, the prime and the tierce and the quint and the high singing nominal, and each of them lives in a different band of the metal and answers to a different cut, so that to lower the one you pair here near the sound bow, and to bring the other home you pair there higher toward the waist, and a hair too much taken can never be given back. She tuned by ear alone, as her grandfather had, striking and listening and shaving and striking again, chasing the hum down until it lay a true octave under, coaxing the prime to stand clean and strong, working and working at the metal until the hum and the prime and the high nominal, that in a false bell, fight and beat and sour one another, came at the last into that rare full accord that the trade calls a true hung bell, and that the ear knows for truth the instant it sounds, all the voices of the one bell singing together and not against, the silver riding clean over the silken depth, one great chord out of one great throat. And when it came right, when she struck it the last time, and it gave her back that whole true singing accord, with never a beat nor a wolf in it, she set down her tool and stood a long moment with her head bowed and her hand upon the cold shoulder of the bell, and she did not weep, but she was a long time before she spoke, and what she said was only, "Lo, that will do, grandfather," and nothing more. Then there was the raising, and that was the captain's hour, and he had waited for it and made ready for it these many weeks, with the same grave, unhurried care he brought to all his work. For it is one thing to cast a great bell, and quite another to lift near a ton of it high into an old stone tower, and hang it true in its frame, without harm to the bell, or the men, or the tower. And this was Marsh's own old trade, the gun-founder turned bell-hanger, and he did it as a master does, saying little and forgetting nothing. He had rigged his gin and his blocks in the belfry against the coming of the bell, and rove his falls, and gone over every timber of the great oak frame, and every pin and every gudgeon with his own hands. And on the appointed day they brought the tuned bell across the water meadows on a low, broad, wheeled dray behind a team of the captain's own borrowing, slow and steady over the soft ground, and up to the foot of the tower where half the town found reason to be passing, and none would say why. And the captain took the strain on his falls. And the great bell went up the outside of the gray tower, turning slow against the sky, up past the long lancet windows, up past the string courses worn round with age, up to the belfry stage, and in, and there through a long afternoon of quiet, skilled labor, of levers and packing and the fraction of an inch nudging that such work is truly made of. Marsh and his gear brought the crown of the bell up under the great oak headstock and settled it home and bolted it fast, true and plumb and swinging free of every wall, hung at last in the frame that had stood empty and waiting these 2 years and more since the old man's fires went cold. And then the tackle came off it, and the men came down, and the belfry was shut, and the bell hung there alone in the high dark of the tower over the town, near a ton of silver-throated bronze that had been a cold furnace and a broken promise and a woman's stubborn faith not 4 months since, hung true and tuned true and dumb as the grave, for it had not yet been struck. That was the one thing left, and it was not Esther's to do nor the captain's. The great tenor was to give its first true stroke over the assembled county on the morning of the rededication, when the cathedral was hallowed anew, and the whole close and chapter and city gathered under the tower to hear whether the old man's dying charge had been kept or broken. And until that morning and that stroke the bell would keep its voice shut behind its lips as it had kept it shut in, the metal before ever she freed it. And so we come to that morning, and I will bring you no further into it than its first gray light. For what befell when the bell was struck is a tale in itself and must be told whole and in its place, but the morning came, clear and cold and washed with a thin spring sun, and the bells of the lesser sort were already ringing up and down the county to call the folk in, and the roads to the close filled with carriages and carts and folk afoot in their best, and the cousin came in his claret coat with something folded flat and careful in his breast, smiling his oiled slow smile at all he passed, and Esther Vale stood apart at the foot of the tower, in a plain gown with her scarred forearms and her level gray eyes, and Croft beside her with his cap in his hands, and Peg and Nan, and the grave captain a little at her back, and high above them all in the shut belfry, against the pale morning sky, hung the great bell she had made, whole and true and silent, waiting for the hand that would wake it, and for everything that waking would bring. There are mornings that come up out of the east so clean and so still that a body knows, before ever a word is spoken, that the day has been laid by for some reckoning, and the morning of the rededication was one of these. For the rain that had hung over the close for a fortnight of Esther Vale's last labor had drawn off in the night, and left the sky washed to a high pale blue, and the frost lay thin and silver on the grass of the close, and on the leads of the roofs, and on the shoulders of the old gray saints in their niches, so that the whole cathedral stood up out of the cold morning like a thing new struck and not yet cooled. And I want you to stand there in the crowd with me, a moment before the bell speaks, because everything that Esther Vale had spent the winter of her life upon was gathered now into the space of one single stroke that had not yet fallen. The close was full. They had come in from the whole of the county to see it, the farmers in their Sunday drab and the townsfolk in their best, the aldermen and the guildsmen in their chains and their furred gowns, the ringers standing by the tower door in a knot with their caps in their hands, the dean in his black and the canons of the chapter ranked behind him upon the steps with the low sun catching the white of their bands, and there was that particular hush over the packed grass that is not silence at all, but 1,000 small sounds pressed down close together. The shuffle of cold feet, the creak of stays, the blowing of a horse somewhere out beyond the wall. A child hushed and hushed again. And over all of it, unstruck, silent, hung high in the dark of the tower where only the pigeons could see it, the great tenor bell that a woman had cast. She stood a little apart, as she had stood apart in the attorney's chamber a year before, when this whole matter began, in the same russet-brown gown made over twice, with her dark auburn hair drawn back under the plain linen cap and the old pale burn scar showing on her forearm where the sleeve was turned. And she did not look up at the tower, and she did not look at the dean, and she did not look at her cousin, who stood in his claret broadcloth among the guildsmen, with his soft pink hands folded upon the head of his stick, and a look upon his face of a man who has come to a christening quite certain the child will be named for him. She looked at nothing. She had her head a little on one side, the way a person holds it who is listening for a sound not yet come, and I have told you already through this long tale that Esther Vale could no more stand in the world and not read the true note of a struck thing than another woman could stand in a garden and not smell the roses. And so she stood with her whole self gone out ahead of her up into the dark of the tower, waiting, not for the glory of it, but to hear whether the thing she had made was true. For that was the only question she had ever truly asked of it. All the rest of it, the will, the deadline, the cousin, the whole cold weight of the county's certainty that she was beaten, all of that had never been to her more than weather. The one question was whether the bell would ring true, and in a moment now she would know, and so would everyone else, and there was not a thing more that her two scarred hands could do about it. The dean lifted his hand. The ringers had rigged a rope to the clapper for the first stroke, that it might be struck alone and clean, one single note into the morning before ever the peal began, and a boy of the choir had the fall of it, and the dean spoke the short prayer of dedication in his dry cathedral voice, giving the bell over to the service of God and the calling of the faithful, and named it, for they had named it for the old saint of the place. And then he let his hand fall, and the boy hauled, and the clapper swung the long, slow swing of a great bell, and struck, and the note came down. I have stood in my time under bells enough, and I will tell you that most of them speak and are done. They give you their one flat clang, and it is gone, and you are only glad the peal is fugue, and not one bell. But this was not that. This came down out of the tower, and did not fall. It opened. It opened the way a flower opens, or the way the eastern sky opens, at the very moment the sun's rim clears the hill, all at once, and yet unhurried. And it filled the close from the grass to the roof leads with one great round singing tone that had a shine on it, a silver on it, a thing you could no more mistake than you could mistake moonlight for lamplight. For there is a plain bronze note that is only loud, and there is a true bell's note that seems to have light inside it. And this had light inside it. a low, warm silver light that hung and would not die. And under the great sung nominal of it, if you had the ear, you could hear the whole ladder of the lesser notes standing up true beneath, the hum below going on longest of all, so that the one stroke was not one note at all, but a chord. A single struck chord ringing in accord with itself, and it went out over the packed heads and over the wall and out across the frost-white county, like a hand laid flat and gentle upon the whole cold morning. I saw an old woman near me put her hand to her mouth. I saw a ringer, a hard old man who had rung 1,000 bells, shut his eyes, and it hung in the air a long, long time after the boy had let the rope go slack, thinning and never quite ending, folding away at last into the blue so slow that no man in that close could have told you the moment it was gone. And that is the silver, silken tone of a veil bell, that a man cannot tell the instant it leaves him, and it is the thing that no receipt bought in a shop and no ordinary honest founder can raise. And it is the thing her grandfather Amos Vale had carried in his ciphered chest to his grave and left to the one pair of hands that could read it. And in the great held breath after that note, before the dean could so much as signal the ringers to the peal, the cousin stepped forward onto the grass with a paper in his hand. He had timed it, you understand. That was the cruelty and the cleverness of the man all through, that he never struck at the work. He only ever struck at the world's belief about the work, and he had judged to a nicety that the moment to seize the bell was the very moment it had proved itself glorious, when there was a fortune of good repute suddenly hanging in that tower and every eye in the county fixed upon it. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He turned a little so that the dean and the aldermen might all mark him, and he said, in a tone of grave and reasonable regret, that before the county went further in its rejoicing there was a plain matter of right and property that in honesty must be set straight, that the bell so justly admired was the work and the lawful property of his own foundry, that the poor young woman yonder had been suffered, out of family kindness, to keep the yard swept and to fetch and carry through the casting, but that the commission itself, the scale, the metal, and the master's hand upon the whole of it, had been his. And he held up the paper, and unfolded it, and said it was a deed of assignment, drawn and witnessed and signed by the late Amos Vale's own hand in his last sickness, making over the commission and all the profit and credit of it to his cousin and nearest kinsman in the trade, the old man having known well, said the cousin, with a soft, sorrowing shake of his head, that a girl could never bring it home. I will not pretend to you that the close did not sway toward him. A crowd is a weathercock, and it had been taught this whole year long by the guild and the gossip that a woman's bell was a thing against nature. And here was a prosperous man in broadcloth, with a paper and a sorrowful face, and there was the girl in her turned gown who had said not one word in her own defense. And I saw the dean's face go grave and troubled, and I saw the aldermen put their heads together, and I felt the morning tilt. For a forged paper in a public place is a wicked, strong thing, because the shame of doubting it falls on the honest, and the cousin knew that too. But he had made, at the very last, the one mistake that a man of his kind was always bound to make, which was that he had never once in his life bent his own back over a mold, and so he did not truly know, could not know, having never made anything, what it is that a made thing carries in it of the hand that made it. He thought a bell was a piece of property, a weight of bronze with a price on it, a thing you could sign over on a sheet of paper the way you sign over a field or a cart. He did not understand that the bell in that tower was a letter, and that it was signed. It was Esther who spoke now, for the first time, and she did not speak to the cousin at all. She spoke to the dean, and her voice was low and level and carried in the frost the way a true note carries, and she said, "My lord dean, a paper may be written by any hand that can hold a pen, but a bell is written by only the hand that casts it, and this bell will bear me witness if you will let it be looked at. For I have set my witnesses into the metal where no forger's pen could follow. Send your own men up into the tower. You will find, cast raised in the inscription band that runs about the shoulder of the bell, below the great letters of the holy words, my grandfather's founder's mark, which is 3 bells and a hammer within a shield, the mark of the Vale foundry that the chapter's own old accounts will show upon every bell this house has bought these 60 years. And set beside it, small, where a man must know to look, you will find 2 letters more, an E and a V, which are my own, Esther Vale, cut by my own hand into the wax before ever the metal was run. For I have signed my work as my grandfather signed his, and as his father signed before him. And you will find them again, those same marks, cast into the crown of the bell up under the headstock where no eye ever goes, and no hand could reach to add them after. For a mark upon the crown, my lord, must be molded before the pour, it cannot be graven in after, as any founder in this county will swear to you. Let your men go up and read the bell." There was a stir at that, and the dean, who was a fair man under his gravity, sent 2 of the chapter and 2 of the ringers, and I was glad to see one of the plain aldermen who was a doubter, up the black stair into the tower with a lantern. And we stood in the cold and waited, and the cousin stood too. And I watched his soft face, and I saw the first fine thread of the sweat come out upon it. For he had not known about the crown. He had reckoned, if he had reckoned at all, on the inscription band, which he might have brazened out as a thing added or a thing meaning nothing. He had not known that a veil sets the mark twice, once for the world to find, and once hidden in the crown for the truth to find, and that the second was cast into the very pour, and could no more be forged onto that bell after the fact than a man could forge the grain into a grown oak. And presently the men came down, and the alderman who was a doubter came down last and slowest, and his face had changed, and he said, before the dean could ask him, loud enough for the near ranks to hear, "They are there. The mark and the 2 letters, upon the band and again upon the crown, raised in the casting, sir, molded, not cut. No tool has been near them. They were put there before the metal." Now the cousin's paper began to weigh a great deal less in the balance of that close, but he was not a man to fall at the first blow, and he rallied and said, smooth still though the sweat stood on him, that marks proved nothing, that the girl might have set her letters on a mold his men had built to his scale, that the credit of the design and the craft was the thing, and that was his. And it was here that Esther did the second thing, and it was the colder and the deeper of the 2, and it went to the heart of the whole mystery of the tale. She had brought with her, wrapped in oilcloth, her grandfather's book. She did not give it to the cousin. She gave it to the dean, and she opened it before him to the great double sheet where the scale of this very bell was drawn, the profile of it, the long subtle curve from crown to sound bow that is the whole secret of a true bell, the curve that decides whether the note will ring in accord with itself or fight itself and go sour. And I want you to understand what the dean and the canon saw when they looked down at that page, for they did not see a drawing such as you or I would call a drawing. They saw the shape of the bell laid out clean enough, yes, but every figure upon it, every measure of the thickness at every point of the curve, every note of the metal and the heat and the true dimensions, was written in a close crabbed cipher of the old man's own devising. A running hand of letters that were not letters and numbers that stood for other numbers. a private shorthand that Amos Vale had built for himself across a lifetime so that no rival could ever buy or steal or copy the scale of a Vale bell, and it was gibberish upon the page to every soul in that close but one. And Esther said, "Quiet, this is the scale by which that bell was cast, my lord, and it is written in my grandfather's cipher, which he taught to me across 20 years, hour by hour, at his knee and at his bench, and which he taught, upon his oath and upon mine, to no other living creature. My cousin holds a foundry and 40 men, and I do not doubt he can read a plain drawing as well as any master in England. Set him to read one line of this. Set any founder in the kingdom to read one line of it. If the design and the scale are his, as he swears, then let him stand here before you all, and read me back the thickness of that bell at the sound bow from his own commission's own drawing. And if he cannot read it, my lord, then he never drew it, and he never owned it, and he has sworn a false oath upon a false paper in the face of this whole county and in the shadow of this church." And she held the open book out toward her cousin across the frosty grass, and the whole close turned and looked at him, and he did not take it. He could not take it. He stood with his soft hands upon his stick and his mouth a little open, and the thing that had held him up all this year, which was the world's willingness to believe a comfortable man over an uncomfortable truth, went out of the close like water out of a cracked crock, all at once, and left him standing dry. For every man there could see it plain that the paper in his hand claimed a thing his own 2 hands could not do, and there is no gainsaying that. A liar may swear he built a house, but stand him in the cellar and bid him name the joists, and the house itself will call him liar. But Esther Vale was not yet done, and to her mind she had not yet answered the only question that had ever mattered to her, and so she asked for the 3rd witness, and it was the greatest of the 3, and it was the bell itself. There had come to the rededication, sent for by the dean's own prudence weeks before against just such a dispute of craft, for the chapter had known there would be a wrangle over so great and so strange a commission. A stranger, a spare gray silent man from the north country, a master bell founder of 40 years' standing, whose name was known and trusted in every steeple house in the kingdom, and who had no interest in the world in Esther Vale, or her cousin, or the county of their quarrel. And the dean now called this man forward, and put it to him plainly, before them all, to judge the thing by his craft. And the old master went up into the tower himself, alone, with his own small hammer of tuning metal that such men carry. And he was gone a long while, and we heard him, up in the dark, striking the bell. Not the great swung stroke of the ringing, but the small, deliberate taps of a man testing a note in its parts. Here at the sound bow, here at the waist, here up toward the shoulder, listening between each tap with his gray head bent. For you must know that a great bell does not sing one note but 5 and more together. And it is the standing of these one against another, the hum, and the prime above it, and the tierce, and the quint, and the nominal riding over all, that a false-tuned bell gets wrong and jangling, and a true-tuned bell gets clean, and only a master of the trade can strike a bell in its several places, and take down its partials the way a physician takes a pulse, and say from that alone whether the hand that raised it knew the deep mystery of the craft, or only its outward show. He came down at last, the gray stranger, and he did not look at Esther, and he did not look at the cousin. He looked at the dean. And he spoke to the dean, and his voice was flat and northern and entirely without warmth, which is why not a soul there dreamed of doubting him. He said, "My lord, I have tried the bell in all its partials. The hum is true. The prime stands true above it. The tierce is a true minor third, which is the very devil to strike, and holds in scarce one bell in 20, and it holds here. The quint is true, and the nominal is true, and the whole of it rings in accord with itself, as sweet as any bell I have laid a hammer to in 40 years, and sweeter than most. And I will tell you more than you asked me, my lord, since there is a dispute of hands here, and it is a shame to see it. This tone, this silver upon the voice of it, he lifted his chin the least degree toward the tower. I have heard it before, twice in my life, both times upon bells I knew to come from the one old house down in this country, the house of Vale. There is a secret in the metal of it, and a secret in the scale of it that I do not have, and would give a good deal to have, and that no founder now living has, saving whoever it was that cast this bell. I do not know your young woman, and I do not know your gentleman, and it is nothing to me which of them wins the day. But I will set my name and my 40 years to this, that the hand which raised this bell was a Vale hand trained in the Vale mystery, and that there is no other founder breathing in this kingdom, myself and all my brethren of the guild included, who could have brought that tone up out of the pit. Whoever tells you otherwise, my lord, does not know bells. And that was the end of it. There was no thunderclap. The great reckonings of this world seldom come with one. There was only a gray old stranger's flat northern voice laying down the plain truth of the craft, and the truth of the craft agreeing, note for note, with the mark in the crown, and the cipher in the book, and the two small letters E and V cut into the wax by a woman's hand before the metal ever ran. 3 witnesses, the eye, the book, and the ear, and all 3 saying the one thing. The magistrate was there among the aldermen, a justice of the county, and he did now what such men are for. He stepped out, and he took the paper from the cousin's slack hand. The cousin let it go without a fight, which told its own tale, and he read it over slow before the whole close, and then he read it out for the forgery it was, naming it plainly. The false deed, the forged hand of a dead honest man, the false oath sworn in a public place, and he told the cousin he would answer for it at the assize, and 2 of the constables came and stood at the man's soft elbows, and he went out of the close between them, with his face gone the gray of cold ash, and I will spend no more of this tale upon him, for he had spent his whole self upon seeming, and when the seeming was struck away there was simply nothing of him left to tell. And so the bell rang. The dean gave the sign, and the ringers went up, and the whole peal broke out over the county at last, the great Vale tenor at the bottom of it holding all the rest up on its shoulders, the way the deep truth holds up all the bright quick things above it. And it rang and rang across the frost in the fields, and folk who were miles off in their farmyards that morning stopped with the pail in their hands and turned their faces toward the sound without knowing why. Because a true bell does that to a body. It reaches into you under the place where words go. And Esther Vale stood in the ringing with her head a little on one side, listening. And I will tell you that this, not the magistrate, not the cousin's ruin, not the crowd at last come round to cheer her, this was the moment the year had been for. She had asked one question of that bell, whether it was true, and now, in the full open peal of it, she had her answer, and it was yes. And I saw her close her eyes, and I saw the hard-held line of her shoulders come down at last. And that was all. She had never wanted the county's cheer. She had wanted the note to be true, and it was true, and that was enough. And it had always been enough. And it is a great and quieting thing to see a soul that wants only that one honest thing and, having got it, is at peace. Now I could leave you there in the ringing, and it would make a tidy end. But you have come the whole long way with me, and you are owed the after of it. which is the better part, for the world had given the Vale Foundry up for dead, and the after of this tale is the tale of a dead fire found to be only banked. Esther kept the works. The commission fulfilled, the will was hers by its own hard terms, the cottage, the close of ground, the crane and the pit and the loam benches, the cold reverberatory furnace that was cold no longer, and the very county that had waited a year to see her fail now could not get its orders in fast enough. For there is nothing on this earth so eager to buy a thing as the crowd that swore it could not be made. And she reopened the Vale Foundry in her own name, over her own door, and lit the furnace, and it has not gone cold since. She set the girls at the molds. You will remember Peg, that was sturdy and strong in the arm and that no master would take, and watchful Nan with the quick eyes. They had stood the bad nights with her, and swept the loam, and carried the copper, when there was not a man in the county would be seen at a woman's fire. And she did not forget it, for Esther Vale paid her debts in the only true coin, which is trust. She made them her people, taught and kept and paid, and set them at the benches to learn the sweep of the strickleboard and the reading of the heat, and the cleverest of them, it was Nan, the watchful one, as I always thought it would be. Esther took aside one winter, and opened the ciphered book to her, and began, hour by hour at the bench, as her own grandfather had begun with her, to teach her the cipher. And I hold that to be the truest and the wisest thing in all this tale, truer even than the bell, for a bell, when all is said, is one bell, and it rings its life and cracks at last and is melted down and cast again. But the mystery of the making of it, the deep, close-kept art of it, had come within one old man's death of going out of the world altogether, banked so low in one dying grate that a puff of ill wind would have put it out forever. And Esther Vale, who knew to her bones what it is to be the last living soul that can read a thing, would not let it hang by a single life again. She gave it forward. She put it into a second head and swore that head to give it to a third, so that the art should never again lie at the mercy of one heart's stopping. And that, and not the great bell in the tower, is the true monument of her, that she would not let the knowing die. She kept old Croft, too, her grandfather's half-deaf furnaceman, who had swept the dead yard out of grief through all the cold year when there was neither wage, nor work, nor hope in it. She kept him at the furnace mouth to the end of his days, though his ear was near gone, and his hand was slow, because a foundry is not only its fires, but its faithfulness, and Simon Croft had been faithful when faith was all there was, and she gave him his corner and his pipe and his place at the hearth, until he died full of years with the warmth of a living furnace on his old face, which is as good an end as this world hands out. And Captain Marsh, I have kept him for last, as she did. You will remember the grave widowed man, the old gun founder turned bell hanger, who had lent his first load of copper without a breath of pity, and stood her worst nights, and mended her broken tackle with his own hands, and had never once, in all of it, offered to rescue her, which is the one thing she could not have borne. He did not court her through that year, he worked beside her, which in the end is the deeper thing. And when it was all done, and the foundry lit, and the girls at the benches, and the peace come down at last, the two of them came together in the slow way of a slow time, not out of her need, for she needed no man to save her, and he had the sense to know it, and not out of his generosity, for she would have flung generosity back in any man's teeth, but level, plain, and equal beside an equal. Two people who had each stood the fire and knew the exact weight of the other's silence. She took him at the last as she took nothing else in this tale, freely, with no bargain in it and no gratitude owed, and no debt on either side. The one clean joining in the whole story that cost neither of them a thing they were not glad to give. And that is the only kind worth waiting a life for, the kind with no debt in it. And they had it, and I am glad, and I will say no more of it than that. For the best of such things are the ones a tale does not paw over. And there I will leave them, in the warm doorway of a living foundry, with the frost going off the fields and the smoke standing up straight out of the Vale chimney into a clean sky, and a bell somewhere out over the county ringing the hour true. I have sat by my own fire many an evening turning this tale over, and I will tell you the whole of what it has taught me, which is a small thing and an old thing, but I find I never tire of it. The world is very quick to say a thing is dead. It looked at a cold furnace and a penniless woman and a lost art and a guild's easy laughter, and it said, "There, that is finished, that is out, rake it over." But there is all the difference in the world, as any soul who has kept a hearth will tell you, between a fire that is out and a fire that is only banked down low under the gray ash for the night, dark and silent and cold to the careless eye, and yet with the whole live red heart of it still in there, waiting, needing only that one hand that knows to come in the morning and rake the ash aside and lay the tinder close and breathe. The world gives up for dead a great many things that are only banked and not out, a trade, a hope, an old man's mystery, a woman the guild has laughed at, banked, and waiting for the breath. And the whole of the tale you have heard tonight is only this, that a banked fire is not a dead one, and that all it wants is the right hand and the true breath, and it will come up again silver in the morning and ring the whole county awake. Now there is a little bell below this hearth of ours. You will see it there, close to hand, and it costs you nothing, and it is the one small thing you can do to keep this fire of ours banked and warm against the next cold evening. Ring it, if you would, and it will bring you back to this chair and this hearthside when I have another such tale to tell. For I have a great many of them yet, and the kettle is always on. Ring the little bell, bank the fire, do not let it go out. And come you back, and I will be here, and we will begin again.